Okay, we're live, everybody. Good morning and welcome to the Saturday, May 2nd, 2026 edition of the Saturday Free School. We have an important and exciting discussion for today, building on many of our discussions over the past several months. And today, Michelle and Doc will be starting us off on a discussion of the following questions. Is a nonviolent resistance strategy compatible with the new achievement of a new and revolutionary democracy? And does the theorizing of James Lawson and Henry Winston help us to understand such a strategy? So yeah, Michelle and Doc are going to start us off and then we'll have discussion, but I'll hand it over to Michelle.
Yeah, thanks Jeremiah. So I think to frame or to set the foundation for today's discussion, I wanted to bring in a lot of what we've been working out over the last few weeks. And I also wanted to pick up on some points that we left off from last week's discussion. And in preparing for today, I was especially influenced by first our two-day tribute to King, but also the political assessment we had made last week of it. So I think I would like to begin there, and then I'm going to speak some more about James Lawson and kind of some of the assumptions and also the methods of nonviolence and how that might look at this time in history. So I think to begin, one thing that I was thinking about from our discussion last week was how we talked about this hypothesis that we in the Free School have held for years, that King is the father of our new nation, that if we are to have a new civilization, it depends on to what extent the American people are able to inherit Black leadership and the leadership of Black civilization. And I felt what was so positive in our assessment from last week is that with the voice of King, we spoke to the people of Philadelphia, and especially the vanguard of Black institutional life in Philadelphia. And what we discovered is that they spoke back. And, you know, just this idea of our having this hypothesis that Philadelphia is a city, America is a nation in which, you know, perhaps a significant majority of its people are awaiting the voice and the prophecy of a leader like King. And I want to say that I think we can test this hypothesis even on the world stage, or on the stage of the world situation. And similar to Lawson, similar to King, we believe that Black civilization has a special message for the world in the 21st century. So I want to begin by talking about the world situation a little bit, and to ground it again in James Lawson, who has really become an important thinker for us in the 250th of the American Revolution. And just to take one quote from the book that he wrote a few years before he passed away, Revolutionary Nonviolence, he says, quote, "The nonviolent struggle is the only way for us to take a great idea of the 20th century, a great theme from the ancient peoples of our human race, and apply it to the 21st century. We need those campaigns that build upon the nonviolence movement of the 1950s, so the Black freedom movement, if the United States is going to move away from the chaos in our struggles today, the tensions of our day, into the path of making into reality the mandate." I'm saying the mandate. Quote, "We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all are created equal." End quote. So,
Michelle, can I ask you, could you read the first two sentences of that quote again?
"The nonviolent struggle is the only way for us to take a great idea of the 20th century, a great theme from the ancient peoples of our human race, and apply it to the 21st century." So my interpretation of that quote is Lawson, very similar to Winston or to yourself or to Free School, having identified that great flourishing, that great democratic flourishing of especially Afro-Asiatic humanities consciousness in the 20th century. I mean, whether it's King or Lawson or Gandhi, they always emphasize this is a 20th century strategy that will be taken up in the 21st century. But I wanted to start with this quote because I had picked up this book very early in the year when we were planning out the 250th. And now that several of us are reading James Lawson's autobiography, and Doc has also recommended that, it just be something that we study. And I think, it's been emotional for some of us, or that we see parts of ourselves in Lawson. I wanted to bring something from this book because I'm increasingly seeing it as like a companion book or a sister book to his autobiography. It's called Revolutionary Nonviolence. It's quite short and it's much more tactical and strategic. But just like in this quote, all over it is essentially the language of American democracy or the unfinished promise of the American Revolution. And even that line, we have a slightly different interpretation of it in our declaration. We hold these truths to be self-evident that all men are divine. So I say this because Lawson is looking out into the 21st century. He passes, he only passed a few years ago, and he was seeing King's mandate across the world, chaos or community. America is still the greatest purveyor of violence in the world today. And the problem of the 21st century is the problem of imperialism. And so everything he says about nonviolent strategy, I take in this context of him having made a serious political assessment of the world situation. So I think whether it's Nash or Lawson, then saying that nonviolence is still the greatest force for social change in the 21st century. I just want to connect that point to the mandate of peace, or it as a strategy to overcome war and white supremacy in the 21st century. So something else I wanted to emphasize is that whether it was King, Lawson, or Gandhi, they would assert throughout their writings and thought that the majority of the world is basically nonviolent, that they seek peace. I think this is a position that we also hold in free school. Like they seek peace, they seek democracy, and they seek to build up civilization or to contribute to the progression of history and the progression of mankind. And a few of us had attended study group at Mosque 12 last night. And Samir, we were just talking about this, but even Brother David from the Nation of Islam had said something a little bit similar, where he says the white race is an aberrant race because he struggles to join himself with the human family. And there was just one thing that I really liked from what he said, and he called him the little brother, It's like he's the little brother of the human family that has gone astray. But again, just that worldview that the majority of mankind is essentially, is not violent, does not seek violent ends. I think just a few more points about the world situation. This is a point that Doc has made, and I was hoping that you could expand upon later, but the Iranian leadership and the Iranian people as having exercised a heroic victory of nonviolent warfare and having achieved a victory over America as an imperial power in a way that will need to be understood for many years to come. In terms of, just non-retaliation. In the end, thousands of Iranians were killed, including 2,000 civilians, thousands killed in Lebanon. And the children being martyred, the supreme leader being martyred, and not having sought retaliation. In the end, I'm not sure exactly what numbers are true, but I don't think it was more than around a dozen, US service members who were killed, and certainly not civilians. So just given that choice of nuclear war or violent war and nonviolence, this having been just a brilliant display of civilizational nonviolent struggle against imperialism. And then one other thing I just wanted to mention is a few of us have been paying attention to the cross-strait talks between China and Taiwan, and the language of the new chairman of the KMT in Taiwan being so striking, because she talks directly about how she really sees the relationship of Taiwan and China as a question of peace. And before she had made her trip to China in April, she says, quote, like, I'm prepared to cross the sea, cross the Taiwan Strait, and travel to the Chinese mainland to send an important message to the world about the pursuit of peace, end quote. So I just wanted to give a few examples to kind of ground us in the 21st century. And again, like King, we talked about this last week, but in his last book, Where Do We Go From Here? In 1967, he says that war has become obsolete. And I think that formulation is very striking. And the way I interpret it is, again, looking out first at Black civilization, but at the world situation and how the peoples of Asia and Africa are mobilizing in the 21st century. I felt that he was theorizing that, the world humanity is ready to make peace real, to make civilization real, a new civilization in the 21st century. And I would say today that I feel that perhaps the majority of world humanity is searching for King's vision of a beloved community. So again, like James Lawson, he was called by King as the mind of the Black freedom movement, and also as the primary strategist or theorist of nonviolence through the Black freedom movement. And he's so significant to us this year as a thinker because he never stopped searching for the way forward for the American people, even 5-6 decades after King's assassination. Until he passed just a few years ago. And again, he was a witness to the world situation, to the forces of imperialism, to all of the wars in West Asia. He was a witness to, the test of the Black movement after King's assassination and how that revolutionary core scattered. And he also is a witness to the rise of Asia and the collapse of Western civilization, or Western civilization reaching the end of a certain logic that ends in collapse. And he pretty much like uses this language, the Black freedom movement, Western civilization. And he doesn't write it in all of his writings, but like, I think the more we look at him, the better we're able to interpret sometimes very simple statements he's making, because all of this is in his assessment. And, keeping in mind that he was a scientific and revolutionary strategist for social change in the American context, I think an important question for us is, how did he have so much optimism and faith in the future? And this is a question we've asked a couple of times, but he says that in the 21st century, the next nonviolent movement, the next peace movement will have to dwarf anything we've seen in the 20th century. And I interpret that as him essentially saying it must be an all humanity struggle under King's ideal of the world house and the beloved community. But I want to talk a little bit about, where that faith might have come from. And I think, I want to talk a little bit about why this faith, or like why he had so much confidence in the future, because I think King had it too. So for this portion, I was actually inspired by our discussion in Lucian Blackwell this week, and how toward the end of the discussion, Reverend Ike, you had asked a question that I think many people in the society ask. Do we have any grounds for hope in the future? And especially Black people asking the question, can we trust white people, or what what will our relationship to white people be, and what role will white people take, if any, role at all in the democratic struggle for the future? Can white people be redeemed? And this is just how I interpreted some of what you were saying, but this deep betrayal and this deep disappointment in white America, a counter civilization that is so in denial about reality and about, suffering. I was just really impacted by you asking that, because it's a very legitimate question. What can we have faith in?
That reflects the fact that I'm an Episcopalian, right? Yeah.
So I think King has an answer to an extent in that ideal of cosmic companionship. And I don't understand it fully, and I'm hoping we can talk about it more. But this is a common thread that I identified in Gandhi, Thurman, King, and Lawson. And to read just a little bit, this is from King. Having been tested in leadership of the most revolutionary democratic movement in America in the 20th century, he said, quote, "I am convinced that the universe is under the control of a loving purpose, and that in the struggle for righteousness, man has cosmic companionship." And then, of course, Lawson and King were highly influenced by Thurman's Jesus and the Disinherited, which I think is published in the 40s, late 40s. And Thurman says in Jesus and the Disinherited, quote, "The disinherited will know for themselves that there is a spirit at work in life and in the hearts of men which is committed to overcoming the world. For the privileged and underprivileged alike, if the individual puts at the disposal of the spirit the needful dedication and discipline, he can live effectively in the chaos of the present, the high destiny of a son of God," end quote. And then I've also been looking at this book that was published in English called Studies in Gandhiism. And it's written by a very close comrade and secretary to Gandhi during the Indian freedom movement, whose name is Bose. And he says about Gandhi's, political strategy or political theory, quote, "The supreme lesson which Gandhi drew from history is that there is a benevolent law operating behind universal processes. Under its operation, mankind has progressed in course of time toward a deeper realization of the essential unity of life. Barriers between communities are progressively reduced," end quote. So I think something that these thinkers also emphasize, I first read this from Gandhi, but that history is often written from the standpoint of violence, or kind of, especially Western history, like this leader or this nation achieved victory over that. But Gandhi actually calls these events interruptions of history. And what I'm proposing is, and I think we do this in free school, but it's that we must look back at history. Basically, Lawson would say from a nonviolent perspective, but we can say maybe from a creative or generative standpoint. And this is, for example, what makes Du Bois's Black Reconstruction so valuable, or Henry Winston's strategy for a Black agenda so valuable, because they are identifying Black, the leaders of Black civilization as the motive force for actually creating and driving new history. I don't know if I said this very well, but what are the real lessons of history? What is the real historical record? And I think it's valuable for us to keep in mind that it's certainly not the way history is traditionally taught. And I think even in free school, we are constantly discovering, just new lessons from looking at the same history over and over. And I just find it very striking that having each been tested through periods of revolutionary struggle, these thinkers say, like, you know, I'm convinced that there is a divine law, that wrong is forever on the throne, but truth is on the scaffold, and it's the scaffold that sways the future. So that's kind of my answer to the question of faith. But for those who were present at the Tuesday's discussion, like, I felt that Reverend Ike's question was also a two-part question. And the second part kind of being a question of how, you know, just how, and you ask this constantly, you know, how are we going to mount this struggle for revolutionary social change? And here I want to say that, like, I'm reflecting on free school constantly because I feel that we are so doggedly involved in the work of discovering new methods and new techniques of social change. And I think that even, for example, this idea of the mobilization of civilization is so valuable, because how I interpret it is that, you know, in the present, we can discover the laws or some of the natural organization by which civilization, and in America, Black civilization, is a motive force against the evils of white supremacy. And so, like, this is kind of a question that I was hoping we could get into more in our discussion. But, you know, nonviolence being that really big topic for today, to what extent we really feel this is something that can be adopted or presented to the American people as a democratic strategy for freedom. The question that I want to ask, or that I was trying to think through, is to what extent do we see our scientific and social and revolutionary discoveries within that framework of nonviolence? Like, again, like, this is where I want to bring up kind of the human achievements that the Iranian leadership and people were able to mount. And especially that I feel they made King's beloved community ideal more real through, you know, I mean, that being their victory is a victory of having changed the consciousness of especially the American youth, but I think the world's people, really. I mean, everybody saw that courage of the Iranian people. The achievements of the Chinese state and the way that that has, I mean, just it changed the equation for the world's people in ways that, you know, I don't totally understand. But also, like, I feel this really big discovery that we made during the town hall and the King event is that defense and that guardianship of institutions of Black life as essentially being revolutionary, or being heroic is a different way to put it in some way. I mean, to do that at its best, you are identifying that there is an evil in society that comes from white supremacy, and you are seeking to organize a bulwark against it and to organize your people against it. Like, I give these examples because for me, they all become more clear under the framework of, like, oh, this is kind of a strategy for nonviolent resistance in the 21st century, in a new century. And really, I see it as a strategy for uniting people with the force of history to become a historic force in the struggle against imperialism and white supremacy. So just a few more things I want to emphasize is that Lawson, but I think others as well from that Revolutionary Corps, they really, I think Lawson especially, he identified nonviolence as a technique for struggling against war. I think for Gandhi, it was the same, and I'll read a quote later. And for me, that explains why they talked about this army-like discipline that nonviolent action requires. And he says, you know, in the 2013 interview that, I'll just read some of it. Quote, "The military are the most highly organized people for violence." And he's essentially saying that the preparing of any people for struggle kind of requires the inverse, which is, the building up and the training of a nonviolent army, an army of love, an army of disarmament, an army of peace, an army of civilization. And I think what we've seen with the war in Iran and the Iranian people's resistance, but also what we see with the Black Freedom Movement, is that this militancy of nonviolence, its root is the strength of the civilization underneath it. And that's why I think the institutions that we have relationships with of Black Life and Free School, we cherish them so much because we see them as the roots of that tree. And they're so beloved to us, just that fortifying and that guarding and that building of Black civilization. So I also think that nonviolence is, of course, related to the question of love. And that was something that I was hoping we could talk some more about as well. Because its definition is difficult, I think, in some ways. I think that in the context of nonviolence, and even for myself, I identify love at its best as, obviously love in the concrete, which means that it is a love that engages in struggle. But also, I think all of these leaders of the Black Freedom Movement, they always use that language of force. They talk about love, obviously not as a feeling or a sentiment, but as a motive force. So I want to speak about this point of, love in the concrete is a love that engages with struggle. This category of struggle, the first time I encountered it was in the context of the free school, which was 7 years ago at this point. And I wanted to revisit this concept because I think it was one that was kind of difficult for me to grasp at the beginning. How I perceive struggle and how I think I learned to conceive of struggle through my involvement in the free school is that it's a way to meet reality, to face reality. And most of us here at this table know, but I moved to this city when I was 18 and I was so shocked because I saw poverty for the first time in my life. And not just a little bit of poverty, but deep poverty and a lot of violence, just a lot of injustice. And I think I was able to see it, but I'm not sure I was able to face it. Because to face it, you have to understand what your relationship, your identification with it, what your response to it will be. And so how I see struggle is the means of engaging with reality to creatively transform it, to transform injustice into justice. And when I talk about love, or when I think these soldiers of nonviolence talk about love in the context of the Black Freedom Movement, that's how I interpreted it as, almost as identical in definition to struggle, love as making love as making the confrontation with all of the evils of the society possible, and being very motive, therefore. Okay, one more thing I wanted to emphasize about the creation of a nonviolent army is that, Gandhi and Lawson, they emphasize this point that it's not about becoming a perfected human in isolation. Nonviolence is not, again, that's what would make nonviolence abstract or love abstract. It's not about cloistering yourself away from the harshness of, this being a white supremacist nation, this being a world that is grappling with imperialism, and then perfecting yourself separate from all of that. But they all make this interesting formulation, which is that what's most important is that you reach toward perfection as an ideal. And I even think we hear some of this message conveyed, for example, by leaders like Minister Louis Farrakhan, that man can become perfect or that man must become divine. And even at the end of his life, Lawson would say, like, I try to live like Jesus every day, but I do it very poorly. And he's saying that as perhaps the most Christ-like man that I've met in my life, you know, just someone who's so clearly tried to become complete, you know, totally sorted. So I see nonviolence, I see love as a creative driving force to overcome war in the 21st century. I think Gandhi, Thurman, King, Lawson saw it this way as well, because there are forces that would, in the creation of the beloved community, then make war obsolete. They would make the mandate of peace, the world's, you know, the world's basic striving for peace and intercivilizational unity, real. And here, like, I wanted to read that quote I mentioned earlier about Gandhi from Bose. And he said, again, this is like Gandhi's post-comrade. He said, quote, Gandhi recognized that the supreme task facing mankind was to find an effective substitute for war. Okay, one of the last things I want to bring up, and I'm hoping, Doc, you can talk about this more as well. You brought up the question of time, like when we were preparing for this. And for me, I kind of relate it as the question of means and ends, or, you know, so like King, for example, had talked about Jesus as a man or a supreme example of word and deed becoming one. And I was trying to, basically I was trying to emphasize, to understand why in all of this theorizing of nonviolence, like the question of means and ends is so important. And especially this emphasis that means and ends must be one. And I say it's related to time because in free school, you know, I think we have a very kind of like beautiful engagement with the question of time where we don't see it as sequential, you know, like this occurred and then that occurred and now that's behind us and now we're here and this is where we're going. But we see it very dialectically, that we see traces of 1960 in 2026. Oh, we see the counter-revolution of 1890 in 2026, you know, we see 1890 in 1970, you know, all the time. But I think within all of that, the concept of the truth becomes very important. As men like King, Gandhi, Lawson saw it. Remember, like, again, King's mandate, that truth is the scaffold that sways the future, even though wrong is forever on the throne. You know, just this deep conviction that the truth endures, independent of time. And I think Gandhi especially believed that if you sow the seeds of truth, as I think free school very devotingly, like unfailingly does, it bears fruit for eternity. And it's always there to be taken up by a future generation. But I say that it relates to the question of means and ends because, I mean, if means and ends are one, then it's like, it's a little hard for me to put it in the right language, but then we're already literally creating that new civilization. If we are living by and struggling toward what we believe to be the highest principles of the future, or the highest principles of, you know, what this world and what world humanity deserves, that we're literally creating, just bringing the beloved community into existence. And I feel that also answers the question of like, why, on what grounds do we have hope, or on what grounds do we have faith? So the last thing I want to talk about is just, I think, stepping back a little bit and thinking about the rest of the year. And that soon it will be June. Like, I guess we're a third through the year of the 250th. And I feel that, like, something that I've been so moved by and that I feel has been so valuable to our work this year is how much closer we've grown in our relationships and our self-identification with institutions of Black life, and especially Black religious life in Philadelphia. and really just crowning them and appreciating them as institutions of that are contributing, that really have a central role in the advance of the revolutionary struggle to change this country. I also think that us beginning to talk about the role of art and the imaginary, and especially how that expresses the Afro-Asiatic reconstitution, or how Asian humanity has an imaginative answer to the question of imperialism, is very valuable. And yeah, I'm just looking forward, to how we conceive of the rest of the year. And I'm hoping that this can be kind of a central part of it.
Thank you very much, Michelle. Very beautifully done. I'd like to just pick up a couple of the threads of your presentation. I agree with you, and I think we cannot say it enough, that the Ayatollah Ali Khamenei was a man of peace, and he refused to embrace a program of nuclear weapons, because nuclear weapons are the ultimate anti-people, anti-humanity weapon. The ultimate. He refused that. And even after the intentional killing of those 170 children in that school, the Iranians have the missiles and the technology to have carried out an eye for an eye and killed Israeli children, but they refused to. And their policy in this defensive existential war is to, as best they can, disarm the aggressor and attack the military installations. I think I appreciate the fact that you situate Persian civilization, this ancient civilization, in the struggle for peace, which makes even more egregious and more a crime against humanity the words of Donald Trump, that he will destroy a civilization of peace in the name of war. So I appreciate you saying that. I think we have to say it more. The other thing is the recent decision of the U.S. Supreme Court against the Voting Rights Act. This is a white supremacist provocation carried out by degraded human beings, moral mutants. And it is a provocation. And it carries some of the weight or some of the similarity to Plessy v. Ferguson. But it's not going to take 60 years to overturn it as it did in the case of Plessy. This idea that we're going to take the nation back to a white nation as though it was ever that. But we can talk more about that and the struggle against that. I've been carefully reading Lawson's autobiography, and I'm reading it very slowly because I'm constantly stopping to reflect and to think about what he is saying, his life, his early life, and how he was trying to answer in his early life the great problems for the middle of the 20th century, white supremacy and war. And he approached them through his Methodist theological framework and his Christian faith. And so I'm thinking that Lawson of his early life is different from Lawson after this first great revolutionary movement of which he was a participant, and then his attempting the rest of his life to solve the problem of how does that experience become relevant for the 21st century in the struggle against white supremacy and war. I think his philosophical and theological groundings were deeper and different than Lawson at 21, where he goes to prison for refusing to cooperate with the draft and go to Korea. And so, this question of is nonviolence as a strategy and tactic compatible with revolutionary transformation of one of the most violent societies in human history? That's a big question. The immediate answer, without reflecting, if you don't reflect, you would have to say that to bring this violent regime down requires a counter-violence, that there has to be an eye for an eye, and most people who self-identify as revolutionaries would say, if you don't accept the imperative of violence, that shows either that you're afraid or you want a non-revolutionary solution to the problem of violence and racism and war in this society. The problem for them, more than for us, but for them, is that the masses of people don't accept their calculation. They don't. They can scream and sloganize forever, and they will be doing it in some corner among a small group of young people just passing through for the moment. And they will get cheers from them, but from the masses of people, they will be looked upon as really as anti-human. Which raises the question then of a person like Luigi Mangione, an anarchist who believed in the propaganda of the deed. I will act. And that will be a stronger statement than anything you all can do or say. I will sacrifice my own life to make a political statement about what is necessary. But the question is, and I think we discussed this, is Luigi Mangione's actions revolutionary? Which raises the other question, is there a path to revolution that excludes the masses of people?
Yeah, right.
Now, that doesn't mean that every leader of masses of people are leading them to resolve the question of war and white supremacy. Just because you lead the people, or, allegedly lead the people, does not mean that you're leading in the right direction, But neither does that say to us that, well, since we reject what is called reformist, compromised leadership, that we go to Luigi Mangione. The question is, what is the correct path? And the correct path is that path that mobilizes the critical mass of the people to bring about change. If you don't have a strategy, that mobilizes, I'm saying not everybody, even not the majority always, but a critical mass, then you're not a revolutionary. You might have, certain self-serving ambitions. Maybe you want to be, to feel a certain way about yourself. I know for young men, there's always this, to be a man is to be a violent man. Of course, if you read the first part of Lawson's autobiography, he has to contend with that. Can I be a man and not be violent? Can I be a man and not, is my manhood tied up with my ability to fight, to respond in a like manner? And he resolves it early on, which is a beautiful thing to see a young man take a position, and that his stance as a young man was that all questions of humanity have to be resolved from a moral standpoint. What is the moral principle involved? Not just what are the ends that you see, but what is the moral principle? That's Lawson. Even as a kid, young kid, more or less. I think that's where we're beginning. So the question of the revolutionary and moral imperatives are linked inseparably, especially now. If nonviolence as a strategy for social change could be, for some, marginalized as utopian, idealist, unrealizable in the middle part of the 20th century, I think today we would have to conclude, as you put it, the majority of humanity sees nonviolence as the only option at this time. I would even go further. A critical mass of the American people are showing gradually through the fog of war and propaganda, we don't want to study war no more. First step. First step, especially for white America. I consider the struggle for peace and against war, especially for white Americans, as the first step to rejecting whiteness. Because whiteness as an identity is connected and tied up to this sense of white manhood, of patriotism, of war, of violence. That's why when you read the first chapters of Lawson, I know the reason I kept stopping, because I went through the same thing. Why do white young boys and men always want to attack young black males? I mean, we all go through this constantly. You didn't do anything to them. They don't know you, but yet they feel a necessity to spit upon you, to attack you. Why? And it's tied up with whiteness and white manhood, which is toxic for them and for humanity. So the rejection of war is a step back towards the possibility of a moral reconstruction of people that we have generally called white people and who call themselves white people. A moral redoing of them, a huge existential question. I agree with you. If you read social reality properly, and the good thing about free school is that we're not just philosophizing, we're not just theorizing. We do sociology, which means the study of man and woman. the study of people and social relation, the study of the relationships of Black and white people, the key and central relationships sociologically in this society. Anybody that does not want to deal with that does not want to deal with the conditionalities, imperatives of social revolutionary change in this country. You know what I'm saying? And that is why, in a lot of ways, you know, the trade union leadership has separated itself from the great struggle for the moral remaking of this country, and thus for peace and anti-white supremacy. They're not a part of it. You know, most, quote, Marxists are not a part of it. You know, they think they know more, but they don't. It's infantile, but I'll come back to that. So I agree with the way you put it, and I agree with King. And in so many ways, King is the torch leading us to the future. If I just play something, I sent it out. This is, you know, I'm preparing for this. My days and nights, I don't know when it's the day or the night, because I wake up thinking about these things. I just like to play a,
Voice memo. Are you trying to play your?
Oh yeah, the one that's 4 minutes. Maybe we can just.
I thought I was the only one that didn't know how these things work.
Maybe you can.
You
add
might be
something.
the only one. I know how it works. I don't think I lost what I was looking for. But go ahead.
Some thoughts for Saturday Free School, May 2nd, 2026, on the question of, is nonviolence as a strategy and tactics compatible with revolutionary democratic change? Just one point I wish to make, and that is the question of a sustainable movement.
Yeah.
Indeed,
Yeah.
a nonviolent strategy must find tactical ways of creating sustainability. Sustainability has to do with how people can find infinite or multiple ways of participating without breaking their will to fight and leaving them exhausted. In other words, the nonviolent strategy is a protracted one, a strategy of, how would you put it, protracted or long-term battle. The other thing is sustainability has to do with local leaderships, self-reproducing organizations that are fractal, are not one or two dimensions, but are always changing, are fluid, are grassroots oriented. Now, of course, a prolonged or protracted struggle requires a high level of consciousness around basic things like peace and democracy, but it also requires an evolving consciousness. Therefore, political education and education generally of the people. And that is very important because there's always the possibility of disruptive and provocative elements trying to come in and misdirect and distort the development of the grassroots peoples, always self-emerging, self-organizing activity. But I want to say that a nonviolent strategy must be local, grassroots, based upon existing people's organizations. This is why churches and mosques and community centers and cultural organizations and artists and musicians, as well as political theorists and philosophers, are very, very important. In a struggle like this, children and youth are highly valued and make an unbelievable contribution. To encourage and excite them is to ensure that the cadre, the activists, are constantly being reproduced from the children and the youth.
Kevin, so this is, and I don't think I have to explain much. Now, to talk about a movement like that or the way we talk is not to say that what we envision or what we would hope for is inevitable. Things could take a different path, you know? So we have to be prepared for that. But we have to have a way that we will fight. And I think it is unfolding already. We see it in this year. Of course, the churches, you know, stable, enduring institutions of the people. We see it in Mother Bethel. We see it in St. Thomas. We see it in Zion. We see it in Mosque 12, Mosque 35, Mosque 25. You know, we see these stable, reproducing, self-sustaining institutions of the people. And in these institutions, what we witness is a higher level of consciousness than we would find just by random people or even by youth. People think that, well, youth will do it. Youth are impatient. Youth are this, that, and the other. For a nonviolent movement of the type that we're talking about, a revolutionary nonviolent movement, you need stable institutions where people are the authority. The internal dynamic of, for example, the United House of Prayer. I'm reminded of that great interview with Apostle Crawford. Oh, he speaks very confidently. Why? Because he has this powerful institution. You know, they have music, they have art. And, you know, the thing that really impresses me so much, you see it in Mother Bethel, you see it in Mosque 12, you see it at United House, you see it at the Peace Mission, all of this, they are confident. If they were not confident, they could not sustain these institutions. Couldn't do it. And the other thing is, whether they say it like us or not, they believe in people. So The other thing I wanted to talk about is in a nonviolent movement, the role of children and youth. And we've begun to see it in our activities here. First of all, the high level of capacity of children to understand complex ideas, like from Du Bois's Black Reconstruction. Almost fearlessness in approaching art and doing everything. I'm a dancer and a singer, and I act if you need an actor, you know. So children are a source of energy, but also a source of consciousness, and they have a real capability, which is often lost as people age. So children are very, very important. And children and youth, because the separation of childhood and youth is not, it's like a year or two. You know, one year you're a child, the next year you're a teenager, you know? And youth, very important. And the last thing is the role of political education and ideological development. The people are not ideologically static, nor do they seek to be ideologically static. You know, a lot of liberal, postmodern theorists and academics would have you believe that the great mass of people are conservative, anti this, anti the other. Well, they might not accept all of your bromades and prescriptions for the future of humanity, but that does not mean that they are conservative. You know, nor does it mean that they have to accept what you believe. The question is to find commonality among the people. So political education, as you said, dialogue, discussion, meetings. For example, y'all go to Mos 12, meetings, discussion. And it's so important to hear and listen. Even sometimes when it doesn't seem like you want to get up and leave, but we have to listen.
Yes.
To the logic, to the epistemologies of ordinary people. I just want to say this thing. Now, for example, I can't speak for all of free school. I like to speak for myself. I do not begin with the question of nonviolent revolutionary resistance where Lawson began. I don't think free school does either. We have, for example, going through a rigorous multi-year, sometimes you forget how many years it's been, interrogation of philosophy, of art, of music, of civilization. So we start not from Christian love or Christian compassion, we start generally from an ideological and philosophical standpoint, which does not put us at odds with, for example, Christian love. But I think it provides a necessary counterweight to a kind of, and I said this last week, agape love, which is passive too often and is not active in the sense that King and ultimately Lawson transformed it into. I guess we have to explore this concept of love as a sociological, ideological condition for the existence of humanity. We could come back to that. What do you mean love is ideology? You know, isn't love a feeling? Yeah, you see what I'm saying? I love you because I feel good about you. Well, maybe that's a part of it at a certain level. you know, if you want to be Romeo and Juliet. But what about when you grow up and take on political responsibilities that you contextualize within a larger moral framework, within a larger revolutionary objective? In other words, can I stand, is love a revolutionary force of the people and not just something for church? You know, excuse me, I hope you don't get mad at me, Al. Or not just something for the Pope.
Not just something for
For the Pope. Or for the preacher on Sunday. How does this become a force in the lives of individuals and groups? I think it is love as connected to a revolutionary movement. Love as a form of human solidarity, not a form of retreat from life. But we can explore that a little bit more. I think what we're talking about becomes a real possibility because of the global situation and the fact that this country has been gifted with a Black civilization.
Yeah.
By the way, it will take another 200 years to fully evaluate the artistic, intellectual contribution of Black people.
Yeah.
You just take the music. It's impossible to evaluate it. Me and Al came over my crib, you know, to help me put, and, you know, I put on Dinah Washington. She ain't never heard Dinah Washington.
Have. Yeah, but I didn't know how to appreciate it. Keep
Oh
going.
yeah, I'm sorry. But you acted like you. She, you know, it's Dinah Washington of the 1940s and 50s. And I was just, because she helped me set up this equipment I got. And she was just sitting, just struck. You know, and how do you evaluate Dinah Washington? There is, and so you get white, let's just say culture to be fair, civilization, at a dead end, can produce war but can't produce love, can't produce art, can't produce a future. This is a self-admission, they admit it. White public intellectuals admit we're at the end. It's over for us. You know, Trump is us. Trump is whiteness at the end of its day. So, in a lot of ways, he is to be scorned and mocked, and even an image of pity. So stupid, so silly. And he's in a situation of no win. It's only a loss after loss after loss. You know what I'm saying? But he is the white nation. If he were not, why would the Supreme Court carry out this provocation against the Voting Rights Act? The simplest of democratic demands, voting. Why are you going to rethink the 1965 Voting Rights Act and make it a form of racism, Black racism? But like they say, you're going to reap what you sow, hometown. You think you're smart, you think you're doing something cute, it's not going to be long. And that's the way I feel about it. And I don't take, see, y'all are young. I'm of the same generation of them people on the Supreme Court. So I look at them like I look at any other white supremacist. I know how you came up. I know what it was like to go, if you was in college with them, the fraternities and the sororities that they belong to. I know the cowards that they are. It ain't nothing to be afraid of because they're going to reap what they sow and it ain't going to be long. It's not going to be long, believe me. But it was a racist provocation. But what is the answer? To do what we are trying to do, to build from the bottom up. And then we realize that we are not alone. That the world and the masses of American people are asking the question, can nonviolence and revolution be made compatible? Big question. It's not been answered yet. That's what we call squaring the circle. How do we answer that question in the minds of tens of millions of people in this country? How can you do it? I think we know how to explain it. We just have to work on our, a little bit more. This is what the thing of time, you mentioned that. And, I get it from King, where he says, to speed up that time when Black men and white men, Protestants and Catholics, you remember that? To speed up that time. And that's the key word, to speed up time. And he saw the mechanism to speed up time as the movement of the people. And the only movement of the people for revolutionary change will be a movement of nonviolent resistance. In all of its forms. In all of its forms. What we learned from the civil rights movement. There was a Montgomery bus boycott, but then there were the freedom rides. Different levels of commitment. Different levels of participation. Freedom rides, only a small group of advanced forces ready to die. Montgomery bus boycott, everybody withdrawing from an unjust system. You know what I'm saying? And so on. Whatever forms, and it will be multiple forms, they must be sustainable. You must not place upon people tasks. If they try to take them up, they will be exhausted by it. People will say, well, God damn, I tried this and it didn't work and I'm exhausted. I lost my job, my children. You know what I'm saying? You must not put the people in a situation or in situations they are incapable of doing. That's why children are so important. Don't throw children into the freedom rides. They can't do that. That's for a certain type of person. You know what I'm saying? And such. The movement must be sustainable. The movement must have the capacity to grow, to develop qualitatively. You know what I'm saying? And all that we do is such a social experiment.
Yes.
Like when Reverend Calvinist says, y'all have to help me. She said it open. Y'all have to help me. How do I explain Iran to my congregation? Or when Arthur Sudler says, but you have to understand that churches are schizophrenic. They have all kinds of views on every kind of thing. And the social task is to keep them united. Now you're saying united in a larger struggle, which they are capable of. And I think our assessment is absolutely right, especially Black folk. And this is Du Bois coming and going. Have the capacity. We see it all the time. Not everybody. I was saying to Emily, there are parts of the Black community that are what Du Bois called the suppressed tenth, what we have called stranded populations. They're neither in the community, they're kind of halfway in and mainly out. Their values are different from the majority of the Black community. You know what I'm saying? In many cases, young people whose character, whose personality, whose beings have not yet been formed completely. But a society that is so much against them that it makes that journey to full humanhood very difficult. You know, so we got a stranded population. I remember Huey Newton in the Black Panther said that the lumpen proletariat, what we're calling a stranded population, will be the vanguard of the revolution. Why would you say that, Huey? Because they have nothing to lose. But often if you have nothing to lose, you don't have nothing to fight for. You know, if you feel that the loss of voting rights is something to fight for, then it's not that just that you don't have nothing to lose. You have to have something to believe in and something to fight for. Okay? And just a quick thing. When you look at these stranded populations, and we'll go around, I'll kind of show you what I'm talking about. You know, I'm coming from so long. A stranded, you know, like, huh?
On an island.
On an island, separated. You know, many of those families go back 20 generations. Certainly they go back to the end of Reconstruction, and they were never able to recover from the defeat of Reconstruction. And with deindustrialization and then an ideological propaganda entertainment industry, which wishes, well, they did this back at the end of the 19th century, to make the minstrel, the stereotype, the image of what it is to be Black. You got a lot of people that will argue with you day and night. They're the real Black people, the thug. You know what I'm saying? That's the real Black man. You ain't the real, but you know what I'm saying? We have that argument. To the credit of the Nation of Islam, I'm gonna shut up here now. To the credit of the Nation of Islam, they devoted for all of this time to creating a different image of what it is to be a Black man or woman. That's what the FOI training is. That's what the MGT training is. What is a Black woman? What is a Black? Is he or she the stereotype that is sold to us, that we're inundated with? And that is why we are absolutely right. There's good hip hop, but most hip hop ain't worth a dime. Let's keep it real. From the moral grounding of it, who put this out? And everybody wants to answer this question. Why do we call ourselves N-word and B's and hoes and shit? Don't nobody else have no music that focus. Now, where'd that come from? I'm not getting a little emotional. How do you go from a love supreme to this garbage? Somebody had to finance it. And if you really want to know the connections, study Meek Mills. I ain't gonna get into it right now. Study Meek Mills. Study Diddy. Study any of them. How y'all get so rich with such mediocrities? And then I turn on, you know what I'm saying? I turn on Ellington, I'm saying, damn. And then you get you got people that will argue with you that rap and hip hop is the best Black music ever produced by Black people. Okay, you get my point. The artistic ideological renaissance And I'm using the word renaissance as a necessary condition of the new movement. I'm using the word renaissance in the sense of rebirth, rediscovery, reclaiming. So I'm sorry I talked to you.
I wanted to say I agree a lot with Michelle, especially, speaking about the history of the European continent. It's always, when you learn that history from the European perspective, it's this war, then this war, the
Yes.
100-Year War, the French Revolution, and that's how Europeans projected their history onto other continents. But for other continents, it's divided into this civilization, then this civilization, and they never forced the next civilization. If a conqueror from outside came, they integrated into that civilization. They didn't force their language. There's, I saw a reel on Instagram. The man said the French, forced French on North Africa, but other invaders from Africa didn't force their language onto them. The other thing I want to say is I'm thinking a lot about when we were in the Advocate, we were studying Hegel, and we were studying philosophy, and I remember, Doc, you had the formulation that you expanded from Clausewitz, the German general, that war is politics by other means, and you said that politics is
Philosophy
philosophy.
is politics by other means.
Philosophy is politics by other means. Therefore, you could say that philosophy is war by other means. It's necessary to understand, philosophy, so we understand where other people are coming from, where their ideas are coming from, and just to connect nonviolence and human conflict. Most war in movie is portrayed as a last, how many men versus how many men kind of conflict. But in reality, war was a contest of morale between units. So, for example, the Romans would have strict units that did not run when they entered combat, and therefore they could defeat larger groups of people because they didn't break their ranks. Otherwise, the Romans would decimate their soldiers. They would kill one in every 10. And that reminded me, Michelle's presentation on nonviolence reminded me of, we've read Howard Thurman and Jesus and the Disinherited a couple times. And I, my takeaway from that work was that when you have a Jesus, or sorry, a Christ consciousness, like they do in the Nation of Islam, like they try to develop the Nation of Islam, you see the creative solutions out of the problems that life throws at you. And it's not a it's not a magic trick. You're not.
It's not a what?
You're not deluding. People say this about Gandhi, that he was deluding the people. He was being disingenuous, dressing when he was an educated lawyer, dressing as in just a simple robe. And people said he was disingenuous. You're not religious. You're just driving a political agenda. You're manipulating the people. You're a manipulator. And maybe people said that about King. Him being an outside agitator, and the connotations of that. The reality is, King in Pilgrimage to Nonviolence, he really sincerely believed in nonviolence, like all the people who practice nonviolence. And it was the commitment, the commitment of a small group of people. And I want to connect this to this whole idea of morale. The fact that such a small group of people didn't break ranks is what changed, saved the day. So if you look at human history, human conflict, what has changed. So there's this book, Guns, Germs, and Steel. I forget the author.
Jared Diamond.
Jared Diamond.
Oh, yes.
And what the argument is that geography, technology, and germs is what allowed Europe to conquer the rest of the world. But I think there's also a deeper question of that letter from the Russian writer to Tagore,
Tolstoy.
to Tagore, clearly the issue is not numbers of people. For the Indian people and the nonviolent movement, they had violent revolutions, and they clearly outnumbered the British. And there are large sections of Indian people who were armed. The issue was not a military question. The issue was a psychological, a consciousness question of why do you accept being colonized by the British? Why do the masses of people in America accept living under an empire? And so, for someone, a young person confronted with the choice, nonviolence or violence, Diane Nash said, or no, not Diane Nash, I think maybe it was Coretta said, well, what is the, maybe it was Diane Nash, this is the only game in town.
Right.
So for, if you're interested in building a if you're interested in building a violent movement, then, you have to be interested in acquiring felonies. If you're interested in acquiring felonies, you need to create the support system. So, many people are interested in prisoner solidarity, political prisoners, free all political prisoners, but they lack the discipline that the nonviolent movement has. When you take a look at the Nation of Islam, the discipline that it takes to meet with the same curriculum every Friday, men and women, separately. So, I basically attack this question from a strategic point of view, but also analyzing, history and, what, from a different assumptions of what wins the day. And, for so many people, they think it's, you have to be at the right place at the right time. You have to have the people, you have to have the weapons and the technology. But what is, in my opinion, is the morale of the people.
You say the morale, not the morality.
Different from the morality. And, maybe if someone else wants to make the leap of, well, what do they fight for? Look at the Iranians and their doctrine of martyrdom. But yes, I didn't address the question of love. I didn't address the question of time. But that was just my thoughts.
Yeah, I wanted to respond to the presentations from Michelle and Doc, and also sorry, I wasn't there for the last 2 minutes, but what Samir was saying too. I wanted to, I guess, frame it my thoughts in response around this question of where does nonviolence, where is it positioned in the long train of revolutionary thought in the history of humanity, and especially in the modern period of humanity. And I think even beyond strategy, I think it's worth considering nonviolence as a science, as a scientific endeavor, which is, I think, the way that Lawson would talk about it, that Nash would talk about it, that Gandhi would talk about it. And I bring it up because you could say in some ways that the development of nonviolence is the attempt to account for exactly those questions of love, of the values of human beings, of the consciousness of human beings, essential to even the, what you could call the scientific understanding of humanity, of modern societies, of the development and the transformation of society. And in many ways, you could say maybe a thought we could consider is whether or not nonviolence is essentially the attempt to forge a science which is actually civilizational in its scope and in its content. I think the other reason though why I bring up, let's say, how does nonviolence square up against something like Marxism, Leninism, for example? is that I think something that gets lost in, I think, the kind of predominant discussions around nonviolence, especially in the United States today, is I think part of what I feel Marxism does well, which is a credit to Marxism, is being able to identify who the revolutionary agent is in a way that I think sometimes can get kind of murky when people kind of abstractly talk about nonviolence. Like for, let's say, like a Lenin, it's very specific of like, it is the proletarian vanguard and like together with the maybe part of the peasantry, but this class is the revolutionary class. And then you have a party that is at the center and at the vanguard of that revolutionary class. And they are the ones who are responsible for transforming society for these specific scientific historical reasons. And actually, I think that part of what I feel like we've been attempting to develop in free school is a kind of synthesis of Du Boisian sociology and nonviolence, like as it manifests with King and Lawson, in the sense that Du Bois, I think, is the most helpful in allowing us to actually identify who the revolutionary agent of the transformation of this particular society is. And that's why we talk so much about the Black proletariat and about, like Doc said, not just the Black proletariat as a class, but the Black proletariat as organized through their own institutions of social life, which are, the churches, in particular, the mosques, etc. And I feel like that's part of what's missing in terms of even the contemporary discourse around nonviolence, because I feel like nonviolence is so often framed as almost like a yes or no question. Is a protest nonviolent or not? Like, should our political action be nonviolent or not? And I feel like it basically narrows this question of nonviolence down to the most infantile and superficial ways of framing it. And I feel like that's part of the reason why so many of us are dissatisfied with like protests, for example, is because I think if everything is nonviolence, then all of it's permissible and all of it can be part of revolutionary strategy. But I feel like we're after not something which is narrow, we're after something which is like genuinely democratic, but we are after something specific and concrete and based off of our, like Doc said, our understanding of this particular social reality. And I think one thing actually, because Doc had brought up the Supreme Court decision, while people were talking, actually it made me look at, there's this project that the SCLC did in 1965, kind of in the month leading up to the passing of the Voting Rights Act, which was called SCOPE. It was let me try to find the name. It was the Summer Community Organization and Political Education Project. And so SCOPE was a project of the SCLC. It went to 6 different states in the South. It involved 12,000 workers, including 650 college students across the nation, white and Black college students, 150 SCLC staff members, and 400 local volunteers. And I wanted to bring it up because I think it raises the question of, I think, even beyond the form of like the kind of recognizable forms of mass demonstration that the Black freedom movement is most known for, I think the other big pillar for me of even how people like Lawson and King and many others were thinking about nonviolence was these political education campaigns in the South, which voter registration was one concrete achievement. But I feel like what they were after was something broader, which was basically to inject and to bring into reality the democratic mandate, especially of the Black proletariat in the southern states. And it's really interesting if you look at their own internal assessments of the impact of projects like SCOPE. So if you look at, for example, they did surveys. They would look at, let's say, the state of Alabama. Within the SCOPE campaign across Alabama, across many different counties, they would say the actual number of people they registered was around 21,000. But the number of people that the movement involved in what they call political education was much larger than that. They say it's like around 250,000. And then they also tabulate the number of people that were arrested in the course of the Spoke campaign, which was 737. And if you look at all the different states that they looked at, it was similar, where it's like the actual number of people who are involved and become involved in those political education and basically try to advance the consciousness, especially of the Black proletariat in the South, is really large. It encompasses a very large swath of the community. And you still also have the presence of that dedicated revolutionary corps who are willing to be arrested. And I feel like what they were trying to achieve was, essentially like a way of broadening even the scope of what the mass mobilization of nonviolent strategy could do, which was not just through the kind of explicit civil disobedience campaigns, but also through the voter, like the political education projects. And I guess the reason why I bring it up ultimately is that I feel like it's part of what has been, like, I've been thinking about is, does a movement, a mass movement for this century, does it have to be constituted by the majority of society itself? And I was thinking about it because Baldwin, like James Baldwin, has this essay called "In Search of a Majority," and he says actually what we need is not a numerical majority across society, but we need what is in essence a moral majority, but specifically like a kind of coalition or a united front of people who have essentially what Michelle called the moral force to actually almost like push forward change, because essentially the rest of society, like let's say the rest of white people, even if they're not fully on board with a movement itself, like it's like a way of saying that their investment in white supremacy is not strong enough to basically be a force for actual counter-revolution. And and I think, because it's really, sorry, this is just the last statistic, but it's really interesting because, you know, when people talk about the Black freedom movement, they'll say, oh, when King died, he was very unpopular. Or they'll say, oh, when the Black freedom movement was doing its campaigns, they were very unpopular. And it's true. If you look at national polling around the mid-1960s, for example, from Gallup, they would ask in national polling, do you think mass demonstration by Black people are more likely to help or hurt the cause of racial equality? And 74 to 75% of Americans said that it would hurt the cause of equality.
I just need to get that one straight. Massive demonstrations would hurt the cause of equality in America.
Right.
And who was surveyed in this?
I think it was a national survey. I can send you the link to it, but it's like Gallup national surveys from that time. And I guess I bring it up because that is not necessarily a condemnation of even that 3/4 of Americans, but it's a way of acknowledging that that's part of what made the Black freedom movement revolutionary. And also, I feel like it's easy to underestimate how much nonviolence, as it was formulated by people like King and Lawson, was a genuinely genuinely revolutionary, genuinely like radical, like political emergence when it was first developed. And I think part of what I feel like our task is to, in some ways, I want to try to, in some ways it's like, I want to try to politicize this question of nonviolence and to make it something which actually gets to the heart of the actual contradictions that we're dealing with. And it's not something which is just kind of nice, and is just a kind of nice idea that we have, but actually makes it a revolutionary question. And and I think that this conversation will help a lot with that. And because I just feel like part of even like my feelings about this moment are, like I was saying before, like do protests do anything at this point? And when we talk about even the math, like the mobilization of the people, like what does that look like? And I think that those are the kinds of questions that have to be actually grappled with and like discovered for this time. So yeah, those are just kind of my initial reactions and thoughts.
Yeah, I want to. Oh, did you want to go back?
I just want to say a couple things. One, I think the point that you made, Michelle, about love at work and what nonviolence is about, and that in effect, when we operate or act out of love, you make the end become a reality in the present. If I heard you correctly, there's something about that that really does strike me as being true. I'm not so sure you can have morality, by the way, without love. I think it just doesn't work. I think when it comes to demonstrations, I think there's something about what you were saying about Marxism. The Marxist ability to analyze the opposition, so to speak, and I think too many instances, demonstrations don't identify the jugular that you're going for, if you know what I mean. If you think about the bus boycott in Montgomery, let's be very honest about it. In addition to protesting all of the abstract stuff about suffering, that hit that city economically. It had to hit it. My gut tells me that was the same reality in Birmingham with the demonstrations in Birmingham. And my sense is that the sit-ins crippled, for example, downtown business in a place like Atlanta and so forth. So it's not just going after the immorality of segregation, it's going after your pocketbook, baby. And people eventually can respond to that. Strategically speaking now, and again, you struggle to do this all out of love. How do you help folks in this country understand when you're talking about increasing the defense budget by $1.5 trillion? How do you help regular white folks understand, maybe this is messing with you? And that it's kind of like the opportunities available in Reconstruction that never really got as far as it seemed to me they could have, where working class whites and black folks realized, wait a minute, we could get a whole lot further if we could unify somehow, because our interests are not that different when you compare us to the planet classes. How do you help folks to understand that this ridiculous amount of money that gets spent on these crazy wars is hurting us all?
Can I ask you a question?
Yes.
What makes you think they don't already understand that? See, I'm assuming that the baseline now is different than the than the baseline in 1960. In other words, what you just said, people understand. The question is, what is to be done?
I think this education
Would you agree with me?
needs to be done.
Would you agree with me that people already understand?
I question that when Donald Trump can be elected by 77 million people in this country.
Well, hold on. Let's disentangle. Donald Trump was elected, and polls are now showing this, because of the rejection of the Biden-Harris administration. Hold on. And Donald Trump said he would be a president, the likes of which he did the very opposite. You understand? So you ask, well, how did he get elected?
Yeah.
He got elected because he said, I'm for peace. Isn't that so?
Yeah, I wouldn't argue with you at all about the proposition that Donald Trump did not win as much as the Biden and Harris lost. And my conviction on that one is that they were never able to separate themselves from what was going on with the genocide in Gaza at that time.
And they didn't want to.
Well, I know I wouldn't argue with you on that one, Ed.
Yeah.
I think all I'm trying to say is when it comes to, what's the word the word I was trying to use earlier, demonstrations that don't focus on the jugular. If a demonstration for the simple fact of demonstrations, for example,
Absolutely.
that if you can't say we're doing this to accomplish this, and this is our analysis of how we're going to affect that by doing this, then you get lost. My gut tells me that we've got too many people, quote unquote, in the liberal progressive wing at this point, who only want to do something that makes me feel like I did something. You understand what I'm getting at? I wrote my comments as opposed to saying the heart of what we are dealing with as a country has got to do with the whole history of racism that made us compliant in the decision to back a genocide in Gaza, which set us up, in my opinion, to move smoothly into what we've been doing.
Let me ask you a question, Ike.
Yeah.
You see the way free school talks, you see what free school does, right?
Yeah.
Do you think that we are perhaps on the cusp of defining the very thing that Lawson was seeking for in the 20? In other words, that like Michelle said, means and ends are inseparable. In other words, the end and the means, to transform not just something out there, not to have a May Day march with a slogan, but to say, like you said, that we're marching not just for an economic thing, but to transform the people. You understand what I'm saying? And thus, what we're talking about is a deeper struggle, which then I would partially disagree with Jeremiah. See, I think there is a flaw in how Marxists identify the enemy.
Yes.
I think there's a flaw there. And I say it as a person who lived that flaw, But if that flaw is not viewed as a flaw, we can never get to what Lawson and, by the way, Henry Winston were attempting to get at.
My appreciation.
Does that make sense?
Yeah, it makes sense.
Okay.
My appreciation for said preschool is, down there without a limit, so to speak. For lack of a better word, my familiarity with Marxist analysis may not be as good as it should be, as good as I would like. I do think that this business of when you transform stuff, of struggling to be clear strategically about what we're doing and so forth, is very, very important. And I don't see that happening enough. I mean, all of this no change stuff, for example. I mean, come on, people, that might be a nice advertising slogan, but it doesn't help you to formulate your head in relationship. And if I'm regular people that need to be a part of a movement from the bottom up, I need to understand how what I'm doing as a part of the movement affects something that is vital for me and everybody. And I've got to be able to feel like I'm a part of the planning here. I know why I'm boycotting the damn buses in Montgomery, for example.
Can I?
And I just think the other thing I want to say is I think it's got to be based on something in relationship to what love is about. The name of the game is, if there isn't something about love, then what happens almost automatically in a culture like ours, some people get excluded. Some people get looked at as not being of the same value and worth as others. That comes out as flat out racism. And it comes out in the Black community, in my opinion, in terms of class stuff in the Black community, whereby if you work with class Black as opposed to, I don't know, more prosperous or whatever, you're viewed as being of less value. That's part of my problem with the Black church, by the way. The class orientation of Black churches, which means that if you're from in a church in North Philly, if you can't genuinely and honestly accept people who are from the neighborhood if you are coming in from the suburbs. It's just a sad reality. I think the love allows us to support each other. And that's what I see in this. For the first time, I got here today, and we just had a chance to watch folks greet each other as they were coming in. That's an incredibly important part of what sustains people in a struggle. We in this together and we care about each other. And damn it, we love each other. That's why I'm in the struggle. And that's what makes the struggle, that's what makes the ends immediate, so to speak. If I'm doing it out of something approaching some kind of love, whether you can change the dumb Supreme Court decision from the other day or not, you are participating in something that engages that power that sways the future. And I think that power that sways the future is somewhere in the neighborhood of what love is about. And I mean, the bottom line is, I think that's what racism denies, that kind of humanity. And what people long for is the recognition of humanity that comes out of something that approaches.
Go ahead, Michelle.
I'm sorry.
No, go ahead. 'Cause I think you want to respond to something.
No, I just wanted to respond briefly, actually, to the point about activism.
Oh,
And
I'm
then-
sorry. I thought you would.
Yeah,
No, I wanted to.
Go ahead.
Which is-
I'm sorry.
Actually, there's something in the beginning you said, Reverend Ike, about, remember how you were talking about how it's not just about, you said it has to be about the pocketbook? Like, in the beginning of what you said, you were like, the Montgomery bus boycott is also about the pocketbook, which is true to a certain extent. But actually, I think for me, because I work in a labor union, I'm always feeling that the opposite is not emphasized enough. That we, for example, May Day, I was at the May Day rally, I'm at the May Day rally every year. You would think that International Workers' Day would be the time where, the workers, they even say it, workers of the world unite. But the problem is every year, let's just take Philly, the problem with these May Day marches is it's an assumption that just based upon an interest of class, that we are all working class people, that all you need to transform society, transform this country is an economic confrontation. But the issue is, it's not just the economic confrontation, because what you end up seeing in the evidence is that all those people together, yes, it was maybe 1,000 people in the streets yesterday. None of those people left feeling, none of those people knew each other more. No one knew each other more across all you got black, you got white. No one was really necessarily knowing each other more as human beings, let alone, and hence not actually creating the grounds for real solidarity. Because love is not just, you have interests, I have interests. Let's get together and use our interests for good. Transformation comes from if we're going to talk about Iran, for example, to love each other as brothers and sisters in struggle is to know we will die for the same cause. I'm willing to sacrifice for the same vision for the future, for the same cause. So what I'm saying is it's not just economic confrontation. There must be a moral confrontation, which is, I know what you're also getting at. But the thing I just want to say scientifically is, because I just think this is something that was a big discovery for me, was when hearing people like Diane Nash, for example, talk about the lunch sit-ins, for example. The thing that always like surprised me was she said, because I actually was always interested in the Montgomery bus boycott and the sit-ins from a perspective of class struggle, because I come from, as a college student, I really believed in Marxism, Leninism, class struggle, like ending economic exploitation, because like that is, you just see it, like obviously if you're concerned about poverty, then you think I need to end economic exploitation. And then you realize, so like Montgomery bus boycott, I always phrased as, oh, it is the greatest example of, in some ways, a strike. It is a different form of a strike, of working class Black people. But then actually reading Diane Nash, she was like, the thing that people don't understand about these lunch sit-ins is it's not just an economic action. It was actually, most importantly, a moral confrontation. The act of, I'm not trying to, I'm just like, this is me just going on my own spiel, but it's like you sitting, the act of you as a young person, a young revolutionary sitting at that lunch counter and forcing a white waitress to be uncomfortable with you, showing that you this whole time were consenting to an unjust law. Like it is a human moral confrontation, which allows an opportunity, the grounds for a moral remaking of people. And so that's kind of like, because
Well, can I just say, I think that part of the problem is that the protests today have the optics of confrontation, but they're not actual confrontation. And that's why, to be honest, when I think about what nonviolence could look like for this time, the closest example I have is Lucian Blackwell Library, our reading group, to be honest, because it's not like that's the only form it would take. But I do think that when we meet at that library, we're doing something, which to me actually gets closer to what I feel is the real substance of what nonviolence, what it was trying to do. And I feel like it's in part because I don't even think that we're at the stage yet where it's about like confronting the government. Because right now there's a lot of stuff that is happening with, if you look at, let's say, examples of civil disobedience. Like I saw people like were shutting down the New York Stock Exchange yesterday for May Day. I saw there's this man who climbed a bridge in Washington, D.C. and said that he's going to be there until basically the Iran war ends. And like, so there are lots of ways that people are actually directly taking up this question of nonviolence, direct action, civil disobedience, all of which is okay, it's fine. But I feel like, especially with King, and where I feel like he left things off, especially at the point when he was assassinated, is I think that he was trying, like Michelle, he was trying to develop a strategy of how do you actually transform the people themselves. And it's not just about their relationships among each other. And it's not just about the optics of a protest of the government, which I feel like most people have become very cynical about. And I think there's very few things that, and I think part of what was the strong hand of the freedom movement in the 60s is that they had the benefit of the kinds of ways that the Southern governments would crack down and loose violence upon protesters was genuinely shocking and new. But I don't think that that advantage exists today. And the closest thing we have literally is a genocide. A genocide and like actual war is the closest thing we have that like still maybe has the capacity to shock people. But I feel like it has to go, I feel like our task is to try to go beyond that and to try to find new ways of actually reaching the people and creating like, I don't know, so that's kind of what I feel like. It's not just about like, oh, our protests have to be more specific and more tactical, but I feel like actually I feel like we're at a stage where we have to rethink totally, like what is the objective historical like situation that we're in demand in terms of a revolutionary strategy.
Well, I think I wanted to speak to the protest question because I think it's such an important one. And I'm sure that even before many of us had gotten to this table, we had been involved in some form of, protest or direct action as a way of, what we had identified to be a potential tool for social change. Like I know for myself, I used to be very involved in the various radical and left circles, especially of West Philadelphia, and even the anarchist circles before I found this. But I just wanted to highlight something that you had said about nonviolence as a science of social change. Because what was significant about the way that King and Lawson treated the bus boycott And Lawson hadn't even been a part of it. He comes south after the boycott, but he's watching it happen from India. I think they sought to discover the laws, like they sought to scientifically uncover what had been universally revealed about the potential of, Black institutions, Black people, Black mobilization, and then, really fortified it and crystallized it under Lawson's leadership, especially in the Nashville campaign, the Nashville desegregation movement. Like they lifted what was universal out of a spontaneous, nonviolent event. And then it became like a framework that defined those 10 years of revolutionary struggle. And I think what's so different about protest or activism today, actually, like Lawson addresses it directly in an interview that I had actually read from earlier. And he says, quote, activism is not appropriating or practicing the Gandhian science of social change. And then he says, again, nonviolence is both a way of life and a scientific methodological approach.
But you have to explain that now. Both of those sentences. Could you just give us a little?
I want to think a little bit more about the way of life piece. But in
the first sentence you read. Could you?
Activism is not appropriating and practicing the Gandhian science of social change.
I don't understand what that means. Could you? Is there another sentence?
It's the one that I read afterward.
Okay.
Well, I think basically throughout the interview, he spends some time addressing this question of there's so much protest or quote unquote what some people might call nonviolent direct action, and yet there's so little outcome. And it's because they haven't appropriated the substance of nonviolence. I mean, I wouldn't even call protest nonviolent action today for the way that I conceptualize nonviolence. I just wanted to say that.
Question, because this is a very interesting distinction.
Yeah, but can I just say one quick thing too? No, but I think it also gets to the sustainability question that you had brought up, because where my concern is how much it depletes, especially from young people. And that for whatever reason, and I should probably just think about it more, I feel that it's such a common assumption among young people that this is how you affect social change, is to engage in protest. And yet, very quickly, you can kind of see the limit of that method, or that,
And I think you and I have discussed this relevant to Penn and Penn students, how you go from excited activism to cynicism. It's almost a thing of, well, that didn't work anyway. What did we get out of it? You know what I'm saying?
Right.
And I think that hits the very foundation of what Lawson is saying, that we can't, and that's what I think Jeremiah is saying, that protest is not nonviolent resistance in the way that we're thinking about it.
And I'm saying this to say, I think we're trying to lift something from the decades of those experiences. And I mean, I feel like what we're coming to is that the true revolutionary strategy looks so differently from what is in the common imaginary of like, this is nonviolent struggle.
Can I say something? Which is, I think part of it is that there's a watering down or misunderstanding and misappropriation of what we mean by nonviolent resistance. That's one thing. But the other is that the actual scientific or revolutionary assessment or analysis of the crisis is wrong too. So like, because we're not saying, because at least this is my position. I'm not saying a mass protest or a mass movement in the streets is bad. That's not what I'm saying. But I think, for example, the issue of the thousands of people who were in the streets yesterday is that I think people are not, if you listen to the actual stranded populations or masses of people in this city, for example, what you will hear people say is that this is not just a crisis of economic injustice, economic issues. This is an existential crisis, a deep crisis where Lawson he would call it there's such a deep crisis that there's a distortion of the human personality where children are killing children. So we're not talking about like, I only make $12 an hour and can barely afford rent anymore. I'm talking about we live within a system that has reached the bottom of the barrel where there's a degradation of the dignity of man himself, the personality of man himself, that children are being allowed to kill children and no one cares, that we've all consented to it. We all pay our taxes every year. We all have this government and we all consent by not acting or saying anything to children killing children in the city. That is also part of the problem, that we don't have the right, that the thousands of people in the street are not targeting the right issue, and hence they themselves not engaging in the correct antidote to the crisis. That this is, like King said, a spiritual malady. That this is not just we need to reform a broken economic system. We must, because yes, my union's phrase is tax billionaires. All we gotta do it's so simple, guys. All we gotta do is tax billionaires. We can solve the Pennsylvania state deficit. We can fund healthcare. We can fund public transportation. It's so simple, guys. And the assumption is that that the working class is too stupid. The assumption is that the working class is too dumb to know that all you gotta do is tax billionaires. No. The leadership, so-called leadership of trade unions, the Democratic Party, the progressive left, you're too dumb, too removed from the people to know that the urge, the hunger of the people is to solve a spiritual malady that, yes, also allows economic transformation, but a spiritual malady that allows us to kill children at home and in the foreign lands. So like that's part of the equation.
So you're saying that you're putting forward that mass protest, mass demonstration may be part of the answer, but that what's missing right now is.
She's saying the content.
Yes, I know, but the question is the content.
It is a question of the content.
Yeah, and that's also why I think nonviolence, the reason why like we're spending so much time talking about nonviolence is because like I'm trying to say that nonviolence, us defining nonviolence as not just a strategy, but also in some way a worldview or a way of life as an antidote, a civilizational antidote to like what is a very degrading, like to even identify nonviolence or to say like we're not going to be able to just solve the crisis through violent means is because we are just adding fire to more fire. Like we are not providing an antidote to what is a very deep, like, degradation of man. Well, because I actually really took the topic seriously, where like I really read Henry Winston and Lawson this week, because like Doc has been throwing around this thing of Henry Winston, the former chairman of the Communist Party of USA, who's Doc's mentor, and James Lawson, he was like, oh, they're very similar. And I was like, I don't understand why they're similar. Like, I actually really don't, to be honest. And then I actually finally kind of think I got some of it, in the sense that, like, when you read Henry Winston's strategy for a Black agenda, and like, especially his critique of the Black Panther Party, not because he's just looking to critique the Black Panther Party, but because it represents the beginning of the counter-revolution. Like, the late 60s into the 70s onward, where James Lawson and Henry Winston both become very fascinated. And the reason why is they're fascinated by the fact, why is it that we're beginning to see a critique or a undoing of King's revolutionary leadership? And they both identify it, as Lawson says, that there's a deliberate misunderstanding of King by framing him as a leader of Black people, rather than seeing him as a revolutionary. Except Lawson doesn't use the word revolutionary; he says a prophet theologian. So like, and he says Lawson says the reason why King is deliberately like minimized as just a leader of Black people versus a world revolutionary of America, a prophet theologian, is exactly because he had the correct assessment that the weapon of the people to free themselves is actually soul force, nonviolence. He says he doesn't really like to say nonviolence. Lawson is like soul force, satyagraha, like a force of the soul, a force of love. he defines nonviolence as an extension of love, not just love, but an extension of love. Winston, in a similar way, says, King, this is why, honestly, I kind of understand some of the language Doc uses, that Winston sees that the revolutionary strategy of the American people, the most viable strategy, revolutionary strategy of the American people is King's strategy. He says that, and he says, and it's because Henry Winston, as a revolutionary, is starting from the same point of view that I think Doc does a lot of times, which is like, if we all agree that we have yet to achieve freedom, how do you then combat a white supremacist, anti-people state? Like state of America, like state, the state. And if you have this question of how will the people seize state power, how will the people seize power itself, what is the strategy? Winston makes the assertion that King is the actual visionary of mass struggle and mass unity for freedom. And that is why King, at the end of his life, is attempting to like enter a higher state of struggle. But then the emergence of something like the Black Panther Party is actually goes against him. The Black Panther Party arrives at the beginning of the counter-revolution, assuming that the masses of people do not have to engage in struggle. And actually, Winston has this really interesting critique where he basically says the Black Panther Party, especially characterized by Eldridge Cleaver in particular, but Huey Newton also contributes to this too, is the assumption that you can have a defense strategy. And Winston says, we are at a stage of history where the people are not looking for a defense strategy. In fact, Black people have defended themselves for 400 years in this country. They're looking for an offensive strategy that unites the people. And he says, Black people have been the backbone of this economy for 400 years. And Black people are interested, if they have been the foundation of the total economy, they're looking for a strategy that makes the total economy work for the people who produce the total economy. So he's basically looking for a strategy of mass unity, mass struggle. And he argues that King is the closest we've gotten to a visionary of that mass, like strategy for mass unity, mass struggle. So, I mean, that's kind of like, I have more to say, but I don't want to talk for too long. But I did want to agree with like what Michelle was raising, what Jeremiah was raising about. Lawson is significant because Lawson is not treating nonviolence as just a tactic. Lawson is putting forward, he's doing two things at once. He is one, asserting why is it that nonviolence is actually a universal human truth? Why is nonviolence organic to the human being? So then when you take the African American people of this country seriously as an oppressed people, Lawson says oppression itself, Henry was too. Oppression itself does not make you revolutionary. To be oppressed, it does not mean you're revolutionary. It is when you are an oppressed people who crystallize a strategy, a worldview of resistance, that is what makes you revolutionary. And James Lawson argues that it is nonviolence emerging from like, but Black Christianity is not just about the Bible. Black Christianity is the African-American interpretation of the Bible, which then gives forward this concept of revolutionary nonviolence. That is the significance. To believe that like white people talk about Jesus, we are Jesus. That's the difference. White people talk about Jesus, we embody Jesus. And like Lawson even says in his, he has an unpublished book draft in the Vanderbilt library that's available online. And I don't think anyone ever published it. But he says this thing where he was like, you can even go back to Sojourner Truth. Sojourner Truth, who fought for freedom, never had words of malice. She only had words of love because she had negated the hatred of white supremacy itself. That even people like Sojourner Truth, Harriet Tubman, they themselves through this like religious experience, the African-American interpretation of Christianity, like, or you can see it embodied in the spirituals, for example. The spirituals have no single drop of hate in them. That everything emerging from this oppressed people in battle against white supremacy, it produces a worldview that has an antidote itself to white supremacy, which is a living embodiment of the degradation of man himself. Not just Black man, white man too. White supremacy is a degradation of the human personality itself, which is why Lawson is like nonviolence is the sword that heals a sick society, a society that only produces sickness, sick systems, a sick economic system, a sick governance system, and sick human beings, sick values, sick culture. So it's both like, so Lawson, I feel like, is doing two things. He's both explaining why nonviolence has a universal human truth to it. He says something about man seeking to make himself whole, make himself one with God, to heal, to make sickness impossible. But he's also doing the second thing, which we are kind of, was the question that we were answering today of why is it also a revolutionary strategy in this specific period of history? So it's like, it's both things.
No, I feel like Emily basically said what I wanted to say, but better. Because, or more than what I wanted to say and better. Because I think what I'm also hearing or making sense of with the means as the end, or the means being the ends as well, is that, for example, are we saying freedom is only an ends, or is actually the freedom of the human being as part of revolutionary change is both actually the means and the ends? Meaning, in trying to bring about revolutionary change, new human beings were created in order to bring about revolutionary change. But you see through the revolutionary movement of someone like King, of someone like Lawson, they had already become new human beings. And
Yeah, that's interesting.
I think, and so the reason why I bring that up is because this idea even of, I know we talked about the individuals too, but I think it's also what we're trying to say or make sense of in free school, which is the institutions of the people, where we're seeking to unite and bring in democratic institutions of the people in order to bring about change, or meaning it's part of the means. But in some ways, this unity of the institutions of the people is also an end. Meaning the future society that we're trying to build is one where the democratic institutions of the people are working with another and are responsive and have a social contract with the people. So even more concretely, in such a relationship, like with Mother Bethel, is that not just a means to bring about a revolutionary change, but that is also an end? Like in a future society, that's exactly what we would want society to look like.
Yes.
Institutions of the people that are working with one another, assessing the people and their needs, and developing the leaders that can respond to those needs. I think that's one thing. And it's interesting because I was listening to the Lawson interviews too, and maybe this is what Emily you were also saying as well, is that it's interesting where Lawson, of course, he's the architect of nonviolence, and people are familiar, or some people, if they're familiar with Lawson, are familiar with the lunch counter sit-ins. But then as time has progressed, or as the conditions of the country have also changed, in the interview that he had with Free School, and I believe in other places as well, where he's saying that there needs to be more something for the 21st, or nonviolence has to be given a new meaning in the 21st century to meet the conditions of the 21st century. And I think Roger had asked this question, which is, what is that alternative then? Or what would that look like? And he is trying to work that out. I don't know if he speaks to it in his autobiography, but he essentially said something along the lines of, man must know man. He was saying, he was trying to formulate it, which is that we must see the world, we must understand one another. And the way I sort of interpret it, or I'm still trying to make sense of it, is that it also goes back to Du Bois and Winston, where they're saying something where, for example, Winston is like, when he saw the daily worker, what blew his mind as someone growing out of the Jim Crow South was a Black and white person working together in support of or against lynching. And where am I getting with this? Which is what I'm saying is that something about what Lawson was saying towards the end of his life for this century actually almost harkens back to Du Bois and Winston, in the sense of building, essentially, how do you create relationships among people, people and their institutions that, where the means would be part of the ends. And I don't know, I think that part still needs to be worked out. And then I think the other thing is, I don't know if we're past this conversation, but I think really what has even been more solidified over the past week is the depths of white supremacy. Like, what do we mean when we say white supremacy? And I don't think actually for white people, what hurts them the most, or like what we call as white people, or embrace a white ideology, is actually not their pocketbooks. It is their sense of manhood and self and being better than the rest of the world. Because with the Montgomery bus boycotts, I don't think it was actually, the most transformative was not just the economics of bringing down the transportation system at that time, but for the first time, or I don't know for the first time, but for many white folk of that time, it was a shock to their identities that how dare these Black people, or not how, yes, how dare these Black people say something or stand up for themselves to us? Who are they? And that shook their worldviews. And I think that's also something, and the reason why that became clear too is like this past Tuesday when we were at Lucian Blackwell, we're reading The Ordeal of Mansart. And I'm enjoying it so much actually, because I feel like there's a few fundamental Du Bois novels or essays that we're all familiar with, but definitely the trilogy is new. And you're able to revisit some of Du Bois's formulations and what he means through this new format of the fiction, of the fiction. And what is so jarring is that Colonel Breckenridge, who is one of the, I guess, main characters, he's a white former plantation owner, loses essentially he loses his slaves during the Civil War, so forth. But what shocks him so much, what shocks him so much is how dare a Black man walk through the front door and not the side door? Yeah. He'd rather work with the white worker than with Mansart. And it shakes his worldview of him, or his identity, or sense of self. I think it's whether it's during Reconstruction, whether it's during the 60s, it is a question even today with this Iran war. Is it really the fact that if it really were an economic thing, there would have been a better way to work out of this thing where, yeah, oil is like from like $70, $80 a barrel to like 120. This war makes no sense from an economic point of view. But the white man keeps going on because they're like, how dare these dark people stand up to us? And, oh shoot, where am I going? Anyway, and I'm trying to make the connection between what we're saying, which is white supremacy, even to this day, how does it manifest? And in nonviolence, it is a statement of the people that we are not the violent products of a violent war centered civilization. We're a different kind of people that during the civil rights movement, it shocked them that, yeah, like the white people are the animals in terms of how they treated, these disciplined, moral, upstanding people. And I think there's a lot to be worked out, but I think what we're saying about today is that there is that distortion of the human being on all sides. And how do we bring it about essentially human being that Diane Nash says is not absolved from the world, where you're removed from society, but you are a new human, you create a new human being that the society has to fit up against and has to contend with.
I want to say also, like, I was talking with my friend about this on their porch, and I was like, we were like saying how, I mean, we were talking about the economic conditions, and like that's like something that, you know, we in the demonstrations or just like isolated actions, that's like, you know, a primary focus, because it's just so it's like you can't even if you were well off, like, you know, like say my parents, like it's like now you see like things is just really you're really at breaking breaking point, you know, like you thought you were on stable ground, but you ain't had nothing, because, you know, the puppet strings are way above you as an individual. But it's beyond more just like we're talking about, it's beyond a material and economic sense. It's like people, like a true like revolution needs to come from like a spiritual, like I feel like that's a spiritual sense. I feel like that's so lacking, because if we just only attack that like economic part, then like all of the like, it's like I don't know, it's just so it's even within like discussions and like people and like just and I observe and I sit outside a lot and just watch. And I feel like my attention span has just gotten longer and longer. And I just watch the city go by and different areas, and I'm like, why are people not talking to each other? Why did you walk past that lady saying good morning on her porch with your headphones on and your head down and your phone on 10? Why are you not interacting with people that you live amongst? That's how they will continue to win. If we don't know each other, and it's like being here right now, and this is what kind of like brought me and kind of pulls me in, is just the collective consciousness. And, you know, we can get that, you know, by being here at Saturday for School, but I'm not seeing that, unfortunately, in my neighborhood or just in different parts of the city and just in America. Like, that's not, you know, it's like and even then being in the city, we have like, you know, we have the ability to do that very easily, right? We can walk in, all that kind of stuff. It's like, we see people day to day by living here. But yeah, like those isolated circles spiritually, we just won't conquer if we continue to live in these like these bubbles and then obviously that goes and engages in a form of nihilism eventually, because you don't know where to go, you don't know who. So I make that effort all the time to check up on, you know, people, let's check up on others, like, you know, 3 blocks around me, there's a few people I know, check up on them occasionally. If I see them, you know, say, how you doing? You got food? Do you need any like help in terms of like getting to appointments and stuff like that? Simple stuff like that. It just keeps you in contact with people. Sorry, I'm like kind of rambling, but it's just really like the spiritual sense like just continues to hit me. Yeah.
Supposed to be able to say amen.
Yeah. I just wanted to add something to what Michelle previously and Alice was talking about means and ends. And I suddenly remembered that Gandhi considered means and ends to be convertible, you know, interconvertible. And I'm going to try to make sense of what he was saying, because I'm getting parts of what he said in flashes. Because he said that, you know, the world has been enamored with this whole concept of the means justify the ends ever since Machiavelli wrote about it.
Ends justify the means.
Sorry?
It's the other way. Ends justify.
Sorry. The ends justify the means. The ends justify the means. But it'll make sense, well, because I was thinking about this the whole time. But Gandhi would say that, well, ask yourself, does the means justify the ends? That's how it's convertible. Like if you think of the ends as freedom, and your means as being violent, and you can say that violent means justify, like freedom justifies violent means, but do violent means justify the freedom that you're getting? And in my head, that makes no damn sense. And I'll try to explain it. He would say that, and a lot of people would tell him that the English came and using brute strength, brute force, violence, took over the land and subjugated the people of India. Why don't we do that? They're smaller in number, we can overpower them easily. And he would say that, well, I have thought of this. This is not, it's not a radical thought that we can get Swaraj or freedom with violent means. But violent means would lead to us being a violent state. It would lead to us ending up post-freedom, post-independence, to be a nation that still use those violent means to get to that end. And if you think about it, do violent means justify a violent society? You look at the American society, which was built on violence, and you see them perpetrating violence still today. You know, their only response, their only reaction to being threatened by anything, by any small thing, is violence. And now, if you flip that and you think about nonviolence, which he equated with love, and he said that when you think about nonviolent means to achieve freedom, and you get to a point where post-freedom you have a state that is built on a civilizational, moral foundation of love and nonviolence, can you say that nonviolence justifies this end? And that makes a little more sense, that you can think about the means justifying the ends. And, you know, this is how, you know, this entire conversation was making me think that, you know, Gandhi, I think, was a man way beyond, like, ahead of his time. And I think that Michelle is right when she says that nonviolence is a strategy developed in the 20th century to be properly utilized and realized in the 21st century. And, you know, I think, and this is also not going to, this is going to be confusing, but it's still confusing for me. I think that man is the means and man is the ends. And so you cannot
say a little bit more.
So I think I told you it'll be really confusing, but I feel like whatever ends that you are trying to get to, you need man, you need that force within man to get there. And at the end of the day, what you're getting towards is a moral transformation of man himself, you know? And I think this sort of makes sense of a lot of things that Gandhi said during his life, which is never consider nonviolence to be a weapon of the weak and the oppressed. Nonviolence is a weapon of the strongest, in fact. You know, only the strongest people with absolute untenable moral fiber can adopt nonviolent means to get to whatever ends that they wish to get to. And he called it, I remember, he called it a conscious, deliberate restraint put upon one's desire for vengeance. You can be attacked, you can be hurt, you can be put in prison, but the nonviolent force or this practice of nonviolence tells you that you have to restrain that that desire for vengeance, because you have been brought up in a world where you look around and there's retaliation all around, and so you learn from that. But the scientific practice of nonviolence tells you that no, you have to restrain yourself. You have to understand that there's a distinction between evil and the evildoer. And he would say that the satyagrahi, which is a follower of truth, would always remember that distinction. And that it really reminds me of that one interview that Mr. Louis Farrakhan did, where he was talking about white people and whiteness, and he was attacking whiteness. And a lot of white people in the audience said, "You are spreading hate. You are spreading violence. And I am afraid to go out into the streets and interact with Black people now because what will they do to me?" And he very, calmly responds saying that we do not have a history of violence against white people. White people have a history of violence towards us. And your fear comes out of absolutely nothing. You fear that we will do unto you what you have historically done unto us. But we won't, because you are also victims of white supremacy and whiteness. And you also have the chance to reform yourself. And, that he formed a bridge right there, I felt. He formed a bridge between this community that has been plagued by violence, and the violent oppressors, and said that there can be middle ground, there can be common ground, but only if you accept that there is a moral reckoning that you have to go through.
I think it's very important. What Farrakhan did is to rhetorically disarm the argument of white supremacy. And we see it all around us all the time, including the Supreme Court decision.
Right.
To present white people as victims of the Black struggle for freedom. And yes.
Yeah. Well, this war that we're going through right now, I think I agree with Michelle. I think that Iran has mounted a very non-violent offensive.
Yeah.
I can say that, a non-violent offensive. The US, I think everybody knows that the US debt to GDP ratio crossed 1 for the first time since 1945.
Cross one.
The debt to GDP ratio crossed 1, so it's 100%.
I think it's more like 125.
Right. So I mean, that is just technical stuff, but the Wall Street Journal did say that it crossed 100% for the first time since World War II, and people see that, people feel that, and I think that making the people of America realize that their state, that their government is not for them, is a non-violent strategy. I feel like it's a modern, almost non-violent strategy, in line with civil disobedience, in line with purposely breaking unjust laws and then getting punished for it for the whole world to see. Making a theater of it. So yeah, I just want to say.
Does this country have the sense to recognize that this kind of racist imperialist ideology that has us doing all this stuff that we do we have the sense of maybe it's the moral courage to recognize, wait a minute, we've been going down the dumb, wrong road for the longest time. It's time to do a U-turn here. You cross your fingers and you hope and you pray that there is the capacity to do that, right? I still find myself a little bit worried that that capacity may not be there, and that there is rather than give up the privilege of being whiteness, what did Du Bois call it, personal whiteness? Rather than giving up that privilege, I'd rather just go on and die, so to speak. And I mean, that's words.
Let me ask you a question.
Yeah.
Then what does that lead to in terms of what you can do then? If the nation is so mired, what do we do?
We go down swinging.
I feel like that's still ultimately.
Go ahead.
I mean, I feel like one can say that, but I feel like it's still ultimately a kind of pessimistic worldview.
It's what not.
It's a kind of pessimistic worldview of, oh, I don't think that there's actually real hope, but at least I'm going to go down fighting. Yeah. But I feel like if, at least for me, part of what I found really nice about even the revolutionary narrative that we did with the Million Man March speech was Farrakhan, of all people, he's the one who's making the argument to white people that you've been messed up by white supremacy even more than black people have. And I just feel like I do believe that there is a capacity that exists among maybe not every single person in America, but among enough people. And that capacity has to be brought out into the daylight. And we have to try to find ways to bring it into the daylight. But I wanted to say that actually to go back to something that Samir had raised early on about Clausewitz and Lenin. Lenin had this famous formulation of we have to turn the world war into a civil war. And they kind of adopted the Clausewitz formulation of politics as war by other means by saying we have to turn the military war, the world war, into basically another kind of war, which for them is class war. And so you'll see most leftists today will kind of take from that basic proposition of the only way we can even stop the Iran war is through proletarian revolution, which is literally straight from Lenin. But I wanted to say, I feel like the reason why I had even brought up this question of Marxism compared to nonviolence in the beginning is because Lenin, I think, more than any other figure, kind of took those Clausewitz formulations and applied it to the class struggle as a way of saying that what ultimately, like the Bolsheviks were after, was something like total defeat of the capitalists, in the sense that like what they were after was actually the crushing of like that class in society. And they took these concepts from warfare and used it to say like, we have to turn, again, like the world war, the military war into an internal war, and ultimately like the global, the world class struggle and all that stuff. And again, I feel like they were adopting a military mindset onto this question of revolutionary struggle with the purpose of total defeat of basically the capitalist class. Whereas I feel like even if nonviolence takes some of the thinking of what you could call military strategy, what I feel like is so important about the nonviolent method and the nonviolent philosophy as like a genuinely revolutionary approach to transforming society is that, like King says it and Gandhi says it so often, is what we're after is not the defeat of like white people, for example, but we're trying to win over white people away from white supremacy. And I feel like that is really like, so to me, it's really important because I had earlier raised this question of Marxism has such a clear definition of who is a revolutionary agent. I feel like what's so interesting about the Black freedom movement is that it's not, yes, there's a core which is comprised mainly of like, basically, let's say people like King, Black people from like the church, from different institutions, all that. But even then, I think part of what I feel like King was fighting for was the possibility of a revolutionary vanguard that was not just limited to Black people. And that also included basically people of, like, I don't know, you can use different words, but people of conscience. And that was especially why, like, I found this, to go back to like the Scope project that they did in '65, King gave this speech to basically the students who came down for that project. And he said that essentially what we have formed is essentially a new revolutionary alliance between these students and the Black proletariat and the Black community on the basis of the struggle for Black freedom. And Yeah, it's okay if I just read like the small part of it. So he says, for most of the last generation of students, the American dream was to escape comfort, was to escape to comfort, to conformity and security in the ample bosom of the large corporation. Its aspirations were as trivial as its spirit. But while this human disaster was taking place elsewhere in the Deep South, in its towns and cities, some extremely insignificant people, Black people, came abruptly to the end of their patience, and they said in substance, we can take it no longer. The cup of endurance ran over. And so isolated and disinherited Negroes broke loose from psychological and social bondage and began marching down on an unknown road. They did not know what allies they might find, but they bolted the door to that appalling past and started the lonely journey. And not far down the road, they met a new generation of students. They met young people who had decided that if they could not change the world they were given in order to make it unmistakably their own, there was no reason to be educated, and indeed no reason to be living. And so these two groups, deprived in different ways, joined hands and a new social force was born. Negroes had struggled for a century for freedom now with one ally and with another. But each time they battered against the wall of frustration. However, with this new ally, a new type of civil rights was born. And so he basically talks about this new forming of revolution, like a genuinely revolutionary alliance between young people as a category and the Black freedom movement. And he says, the youth of our country have become involved in constructive social struggle because, with their lives yet to live, they earnestly want their lives to have meaning. They know they are touching the immortal when they involve themselves with the wronged and with the maltreated. You are not the lost generation. We are the lost generation because we failed to create the democratic society you were promised as part of your heritage.
Wow.
You are here because you believe that the future is possible. The pessimists who have given up are tracing the footsteps of man back to the jungle and the cave. And I don't know, I just feel like that it's so important because like even like that, like, and this is in many ways the story of us for a lot of us. Like, that sense of the meaninglessness of life that is presented and imposed on young people. King is saying young Americans find a way out by joining with the Black struggle. And I feel like that's important because again, like the Kingian strategy, the Kingian way of waging righteous warfare, nonviolent warfare is not, and this is, I mean, basically the Black Power approach was to almost take something like the Marxist formulation of we have to defeat the capitalists and to kind of almost copy and paste that in some ways onto this question of Black versus white. To be like, at best, we can separate ourselves from white people, or what we're really after is basically the defeat of like the white man.
Yeah.
And what I feel like King offered was the possibility for a way of overcoming white supremacy that allowed ordinary white people and people of all races to join basically with the Black struggle, which I think is it's a different way of thinking about even this question of how do you wage warfare, revolutionary warfare through nonviolence.
And why do you keep using warfare?
Just because
Can't you say struggle?
I mean struggle, but I feel like it's because I feel like it's because Lawson, I feel like so often would talk about these campaigns. What were these campaigns actually trying to achieve? You have the immediate goals of, you know, let's say desegregating the lunch counter. And even if you take it with like, because sorry, this is the last thing is, I was thinking about, I've been thinking about the student encampments from the Cold War. And I think part of what's important to recognize is that in part, there's no way those encampments could have happened if not for the actual concrete demands of divestment.
Yeah.
I think that was a necessary, important, irreplaceable aspect of what galvanized the students in the first place, because everyone has to have a clear sense of like what we're even striving for, struggling for, demanding. But I think the largest thing that we saw as the significance of that moment was what the students were really striving for was something that transcended the immediate demands of divestment. And in many ways, I don't know if you could say the tragedy, but the unfulfilled promise of that was that the students have not yet found a way to translate that larger struggle into essentially a search for what King is presenting.
Actually, I understand why Jeremiah uses the word warfare because interestingly, like in James Lawson's unpublished book that I found on the internet, it's in the Vanderbilt library. It's actually really interesting. It's worth reading, I think. Because I actually think it's better than his the just released autobiography because it's his own language. It was never published. He says every young Black person in American society is a warrior just by having to resist every day.
Yeah.
And it was kind of an interesting, in some ways it kind of reminded me of the way we said, it reminded me of the way we said, like talked about martyrs in the society. Yeah. But it's kind of interesting because he calls it, he's like every day, he had this interesting formulation reflecting on his own life where he was like, every day is a battle. Every day is a battle and every young person who fights to live is a hero. And I thought that was really
You know,
I'd love to like
go
try to
ahead.
synthesize a little bit. Yeah. This is like super energizing, super motivating conversation. Hi, Renee. And yeah, kind of jumping off of what Reverend Ike was saying, Jeremiah, what you're
Speak up a
saying.
little bit, Emily, please.
Yeah. So jumping off, or following the thread of Reverend Ike, kind of asking about Du Bois's personal whiteness, and how that is faltering or not, and then just trying to synthesize a lot of what we've been talking about, and also the whole Kingian three evils, right? The militarism, capitalism, white supremacy, and yeah, I just see, I see a major part of this kind of, grappling and, the process of abandoning personal whiteness is this understanding that the three evils are fully interconnected, right? That it's not just a sense of white superiority that I'm feeling as my identity, but it's interlocked, right? With war, with capitalism, with white supremacy, right? The three evils are together in one. And I just wanted to sort of build on that in the sense of like tying together, I think, what a lot of you guys are saying as far as trying to sort of meld together these different theorizations, right? These different formulations, right? So it's like Du Bois's personal whiteness, right? Du Bois's so much of Du Bois's revolutionary theorization was about how is personal whiteness actually different and distinct from the white supremacist social system, right? Like how are they kind of different manifestations as far as personal whiteness obviously is internalized in white people, but it kind of takes on a life of its own, right? Of course it's based in white supremacy and racism, but it also it manifests in lots of different ways, right? In these kinds of what does it mean to be good? What does it mean to be a moral person? What does it mean to whiteness becomes connotated or whiteness becomes almost synonymous with safety, right?
Right.
Physical, psychological safety. And so it takes on this life of its own when whiteness is internalized inside of inside of identity, inside of psychology. So I feel like Du Bois, right, does that sort of critical thing. But then Lawson, I've been learning so much from y'all about Lawson, right? I hadn't known about him before this. But yeah, Lawson's kind of sense of this universal human truth. Maybe Michelle, you put it that way. I'm interested in this kind of like, of course, Lawson's like not nonviolence, right? Of course, it's about like moral reckoning, right? But I'm interested in kind of, I'm interested in questioning this use of the term morality, basically. And like, I'm interested in like what are like kind of more like stronger words that we could be using as far as like, you know, this sense of like universal human truth, right? It's like truth telling, courage, you know, global humanity, or even this sense of consciousness, right? Like, how do we, like, I guess I'm always interested in like how are we refining the language, right? Or refining the, you know, the methods or sort of our mission and vision here with Free School, right? And so it's like if we, I'm interested in what would it look like to not rely on this concept of morality?
Why do you,
You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Like, I don't. Okay.
why do you raise that as something that is important or necessary?
Because morality, I feel like has lots of, like, to me, it means kind of like a single, almost like correct, like set of standards or like set of values, right? That there's like kind of one way, or like only one way, right? To like think about the world or to act in the world. And I do think that word morality does come out of like sort of Western like notions of, right? Like Western notions of what it means to be a good person, right? So I'm interested in if anyone else has like this kind of like questioning this word. But okay, so I just wanted to say like it's like Du Bois's kind of personal whiteness with this kind of Lawson's nonviolence and universal human truth, but then also with Marxism, with this kind of, you know, scientific, like the practice of dialectics, right? And this kind of like this constant movement between problem solution, right? Problem solution. And I think that also helps me clarify my questioning of the word morality, because I feel like dialectics is sort of like, is a little bit of an antidote to morality in the sense of like there's one right way, because dialectics is all about like, you know, how are we pushing and pulling and like constantly trying to come to the right answer, but you're never going to fully, like it's about the journey, not about the destination sort of thing. I don't know if I'm making sense, but I just wanted to try to like blend together. I find that this whole nonviolence as the strategy of our time, right? Or moving the 20th century sense of nonviolence into the 21st century. I'm just really interested in how that is then merged with Marxist dialectics, and then also merged with Du Bois's, you know, Du Bois's notion of abandoning whiteness. And yeah, there's a lot going on in my brain, but actually, Doc, this is kind of coming out what you were saying at the beginning, because you were saying that Lawson and the kind of, you know, Kingian nonviolence does kind of come out of Christian love, compassion, agape, these things. And so, and then you were like, you said something like you kind of start from a different starting point, right, of the kind of ideological or philosophical standpoint. I'm curious, like, from that, I'm curious, like, what you think about this kind of questioning of the word, of just the terminology of morality. And is that like the most productive term to be using?
Which is,
Like, is morality really like the most productive term to be using, or should we be focusing on like on consciousness, which of course
on what?
consciousness, which of course you already do very strongly, right? But I'm curious, like how we're going about refining the language.
Okay, what I have a defense of morality.
Yeah.
Like why I think that term actually is important. And I think it's important to say that like when I'm talking about morality, I do mean something very different from like moralizing, where I feel like basically I understand why there's a certain reaction of like, oh, like before it was like the white man determining what was moral and saying like, oh, we need to civilize all these darker people and we're actually the most moral people on earth, like blah, blah, blah. I think there is something about that, but I don't think, basically what I think is that I don't think morality is owned by Western civilization or by white people. I think the whole point is to say that actually morality is not like tied to Western civilization or whiteness. And the reason why I think it's important is that white supremacy basically almost like purges society of like moral pillars in the first place. And I think that's what results in basically people, like wandering in the wilderness, not having a frame of reference of like, this is right, this is virtuous, or like, should I be kind to my neighbor? Like, should I be interested in other people? Or should I be fundamentally antisocial? And I think the default of our society already is pretty like amoral to begin with, where there's not actually like a sense of like right or wrong. And I feel like the fact that even like to talk about it assumes that almost like somebody's telling you what's right or wrong versus like what you actually feel organically, like as a human being, what is the right thing to do? And I think when we're talking about like King or Lawson in particular, I think part of what I want to understand better is this thing of them ultimately not being Western men, or basically moving beyond what it means to be a Western man. Because I do think that when King talks about like morality, or when he's like discussing it, it's not from a moralizing position of like everybody should just like could like basically like be dogmatic about this is right and this is wrong. And I think in some ways like our free school philosophy, like in some ways it's not really like a moral maximum of like everybody needs to do this. It's more just like the moral imperative, or even like the Good Samaritan idea of like, if I do this, like what will happen to me, versus if I don't do this, what's going to happen to the other person. And I don't know, I just think that those are like more moral principles of like, do I genuinely believe in the humanity of every person? And am I prepared to enforce that like consistently on a universal level, where I genuinely live as though like what hurts another person hurts me, because all man is like my brother. But I think that, Emily, like what you're saying is that there's a way of dealing with like the moral or the human question that does become dogmatic. Like it's not very dynamic. And I think part of the question is, what is like new morality, or how does it actually engage with these moral questions? And I think that's kind of why, sorry, I'm like rambling a little bit, but I think that's why this thing of King and Lawson in confrontation with a very immoral, amoral Western civilization and trying to find a way through it. And I think that they're important, like basically in juxtaposition to like Black Power, or even like Fanon, where I was reading The Wretched of the Earth after you had mentioned Fanon like a few weeks or months ago. And Fanon's diagnosis of like the problem and the solution is pretty different. And you could say that it is like dialectical still, where he's like, there's a death struggle, like there's a struggle to the death between the colonizer and the colonized. And the only way that the colonized can create a new sense of identity is by violently purging and basically defeating their old relationship to the colonizer. And to the colonizer, they might say that that's immoral, or that doesn't like fit with a certain vision of morality, where it's like, oh, like love, like peace, conform, like, you know, like reform, like it's all going to be okay. And I think Fanon is interesting because in some ways he's trying to move through it. And he basically says like violence is fine, because through that violence, you can create a new man. And ultimately, I think Fanon is like very concerned about creating a new man, a new woman, like basically creating something new that is going to be completely different from like the colonizer or like whiteness. But I think in some ways that asks Shantanu's question of like, can you create something new from old ends? Like, does it actually ultimately help the cause or create, like, does it set into motion the kind of society that, or the kind of people that you want to create by engaging in like violent or like degrading means? And so, yeah, I think that in some ways, like my view of morality, like I also like the term consciousness, but I feel like the consciousness has to be in some ways fundamentally on a higher level than the consciousness of like white society or white supremacy. And in some ways, like I think what Sol was saying too, like what's missing is not just like economic development. What's missing actually is like a spiritual and actually like I would say a moral center. And I think that by a moral center, like when we talk about it, it's not a moral center that is in any way, I think, similar to like the kind of like morality or moralizing that you hear in like mainstream, where like even for instance, like yeah, like the Democratic mainstreams, like they would be like, oh, we just need to put morality back into politics. And it's like, I don't know what kind of morality like you're talking about. Like I don't subscribe to that use of the term. But I do think that people seek like basically like moral consistency and like something like even just searching for like morals in general in society on a new way. And I think that that is actually really important to confronting like the basic and fundamental crisis that we actually face in society.
Yeah, I want to bring that back to something you said earlier, Emily, about nonviolence needing confrontation and like what that means for right now. So like, take for example, something that is on the minds of people of an outrage. Like for example, this revelation of this Epstein class that has seized power and who defiles children and is thus morally bankrupt and unfit to rule society. Or this war in Iran, which we feel also is morally bankrupt for the way they treat children. There has not been, in my estimation, like a true confrontation to these deep ills and problems in society, because none of them have been able to address like the core issue at hand, I feel. And this like moral bankruptcy in like both of these instances has not, let's say, called, you know, what someone would say a proponent of violence, say a violent confrontation. I don't think anyone is like, I mean, maybe there was that one guy that tried to shoot Trump recently, but overall, I don't think people as a whole are trying to take up arms right now against their rulership or I guess the generals right now. I don't see that happening. And I guess the reason why I feel that this confrontation that nonviolence necessitates and mandates and is sorely needed has not been able to manifest is I think there's not a clear enough vision of like what comes after. And I would say that there's this consciousness that and I guess a moral I guess impetus and love in the heart that would clarify the vision, and that in itself would put on the table the nonviolent means. I guess in your case, what you said, Shantanu, the means and the ends are interchangeable. Without a vision for the end, there is not a nonviolent means put on the table. And like to think about, let's say, for example, the war in Iran. I don't think there's for example, clear enough vision for the American people to say, like, what would be my relationship to the people of Iran, and how can I start living that now? How can I start living that now? And this can be, you know, the means of nonviolent resistance against what is currently unacceptable to me. And then in addition, you know, for let's say this Epstein class, what is that leadership or governance that I believe in, that I want in my society, and how can I start working towards that right now as my nonviolent confrontation and struggle against injustice. And I would say that this means would be something that would be able to sustain you in struggle because you're brought closer to that vision of the future that you believe in, even though it would require a great sacrifice and could even cost you your life.
I feel like part of, for me, the point of using the word morality is maybe the premise that people like King staked the movement itself on, which is the belief that no matter what side of society you are occupied in, that there is such a thing as an inner voice of truth that speaks to all people. And I feel like even while there's something, I do think there's something dialectical, or like, I don't know if even dialectic is like the right philosophical categories, but there is something very dynamic about any kind of revolutionary movement. But I feel like if you take, again, like the war in Iran, I feel like it is important to say that there is some inner voice of truth that speaks to almost all Americans that says this is wrong. And bombing children in a school is wrong. And you can use the word morality for it, but I feel like the real thing is like, even when they were doing, like staging those kinds of confrontations of the sit-ins or the freedom rides, I feel like the purpose of the confrontation is to say like, there are two sides in this question of white supremacy and freedom, and only one side is right. And people have to choose which side that they are going to land on. And that's both for the people who are the ones enforcing the violence against, let's say, a demonstrator or Black people, but it's also for society at large. Like, if you boil it down really to this confrontation of a sheriff, for example, like beating a woman or sicking dogs on children, all of that stuff which happened in the movement, it's like there are two sides morally, and you have to choose which side that you're on. And I feel like it's not a way of simplifying reality, but I feel like it's a way of crystallizing what the actual choices are that people can make. I don't know, that's kind of how I feel.
Yeah, no. Great, it's super helpful to think through this. I think all I'm trying to get at is like, you know, when I think about the strategies to organize, you know, my community or the communities that I'm like, when I think about organizing white people, right? Like, you know, I just know that there are like very complex mental models of morality within white people, right? As far as like where their allegiances are, like what are their, like what do they consider moral? What do they consider right? Like, and so so the power of consciousness, like historical consciousness, to me is like, if you can get white people to understand historical consciousness and you know, historical truth, and then build a historical consciousness, then they will understand our notion of morality, right? But at the moment, right, they have a warped, warped sense of morality.
I'm also thinking more about the ordeal of Mansart and basically like Breckenridge and like the white people, like their idea of morality where they're like, oh no, I shouldn't lie, but like it's totally fine that I'm so racist or that I just like that I literally enslaved Black people. But my sense of morality is like I shouldn't lie. Like I think it's true that there is a lot of baggage or like sort of lodged conceptions of what is moral or what like being virtuous is. But I think partially how I see the civil rights movement or the King and Lawson vision is that, I guess similar to Fanon in a way, it is the creation of a new man and a new woman. like the moral transformation of American society. And I think, Emily, what you're saying is that the root of it, the foundation of it, must be like basically Black consciousness or Black civilization. But even those, like that existing morality within the Black community is going to be transformed and heightened to a new degree, like able to breathe and give new life. But yeah.
Oh. No, it's gonna say that there's some comments in relation to this morality conversation. We should go first.
No, the way I had interpreted some of what you had said is, it's why I think the category of truth is so important. And I think capital T truth. How I interpreted some of what you were saying is like, each of us goes through the world with the authority of our experience and having achieved a personal truth, like a personal reality that we experience. I feel that so much of what we discussed today is about what happens is how to bring universal truth and personal truth into closer communion. So I just wanted to add that because I think it's a very open question that is dealt with in different ways. But I think at the center, having that concept of capital T truth is, that pillar is everything, because then you know where you're headed toward. Okay, yeah, I guess it's two.
I want to say really quickly about the protest question, that it never came up that, after the civil rights movement, Malcolm X and Martin Luther King were killed, and then, the 60s being the decade of assassinations affected protest movements because protest leaders didn't have the courage to take it as far because there was that warning. And then, we didn't talk about Saul Alinsky and Onskyism and the Chicago political machine and how that's affected activism and also the professionalization, and I wanted to say more about this question of Marxism and nonviolence and also Christianity and morality in that, or for example, Islam, like a religion believes that morality is forever idealized in time, and there's a heaven where everything is ideal, and Marxism is a socio-political framework of changing the world. It doesn't claim, and I don't know. It doesn't have an orthodoxy because it's a framework. But some people accuse Marxism of being teleological with its morality, in that the ends justify the means. Or there's that one Marx quote, when our turn comes, we will apologize for the terror. I think that nonviolence. It's not like it's a synthesis of Marxism and Christianity. It's more its own thing that is a scientific, it can be approached scientifically, the way, we've been reading Coretta Scott King, and she says, we learned from Lawson that, the first step is to assess the political situation. And that I think that what we need to further develop is the science of morality. So I'm trying to make the distinction here from morality from a Marxist perspective, morality from Orthodox Christian perspective, and then morality from what I would call material religion, which is in my opinion, religion comes from what was said earlier by Emily, that when it comes to the Black church, it's more an interpretation of the same Bible that it's always been, but it was the Black interpretation. And I don't consider myself a Black Christian, but I consider myself, I'm not trying to join a Black church, I have, but it's about being a student of the human process. I'm studying because all religion is human religion. And you can't have these books about human beings. I'm studying the process of how do humans develop this morality. And then if that is the case, and I understand the why and the how, then what is the morality of today? Because I'm not a Christian, quote, quote, Orthodox Christian that believes that there's a right and wrong, and it's okay to stone people because we did it in the Bible. That's not my form of morality. But I do think that the seeds are in the Bible to say, he is who is without sin, cast the first stone. But it depends on the human being.
I can read comments.
Oh, John.
Oh,
I just, I was listening to everybody's clamoring up on morality. But from morality comes personal value as well as responsibility and personal commitment for change. And it's if in order for humanity to flourish, we have to have our own personal, unshakable confidence that it will. And it says that, someone was making about society and its complexities. So we have to change our consciousness that truth, justice, and freedom for a new civilization to frame our own individual humanity. And with our own self-assessment, we are the moral fiber to change America.
okay, I'll read comments now. Bambala and Sparks, Todd, John said good morning. And then Bambala says that China actively supports Iran against the unlawful atrocities of the West and Israel. BK and Bambala really liked your remarks, Doc. I think especially your voice memo. Colin said good morning. BK asks, what is the fundamental difference between Biden and Trump for Democrats and Republicans? And then I think a new commenter named Fundamentals was saying that it's a cow versus cow. Like they're the same. Then Fireplay had a short story saying, for years I tried telling a friend to get out and help his neighbors, like this guy like Soul is suggesting. He never did it. We're no longer friends. Then there was a big discussion in the comments about morality, material, spiritual, that realm. Jupiter Hammond said, the spiritual/material binary debate has never been resolved, and it's probably false, as history has shown that most sustained revolutions include both to varying degrees. BK says, morality, spirit, and soul are subjective terms. One may want to clearly define their meaning of these terms before using them to avoid confusion or arguments over the course of conversation and presentation, which I think Karia said before, that we should always define our terms. But then Fireplace said, no, morality is universal. For instance, there's only one moral truth in regards to children. The moral choice is to protect all of them. And then Fireplace says, I hear you, but my point is that there are many who do not see it that way. David Ball said, in the old days of the 20th century, nonviolence was a major problem for men. Now, I think he's referring to how it's like practiced today. Now it isn't. You can't change white male supremacy by educating it on what it has done to us. You change it by becoming its education, by what we do to it. I think that requires a concrete definition of knowing who we are. I think David Ball is saying that basically, like, instead of treating nonviolent resistance, the authentic form of it is not education or just like protest or like performative, like showing you like, oh, like this is the right thing. But basically there has to be some teeth to it, some edge to it, to actually force a confrontation or to become new people in the process. And so I think that's why I'm saying it requires like knowing who we are. And I think like knowing what your power actually is. Bambalai says, most of us know the difference between right and wrong. Many choose not to listen to the inner voice. Morality is deep, even in insects. Karen Moore says, the streets transform depending on who is walking on its path.
So we'll never have the same experience. What we must decide is that we value ourselves and protect all others. Otherwise, no one is safe. And then sent a kissy emoji. Fireplace says, a stranger. Oh, no, but BK and Fireplace know each other. But saying, you think I give a crap about what people who don't put children first think about anything? And then Kari says, that's your subjective point of view, which is fine. And then Fireplace says, if you'd heard me, you wouldn't have responded. So they're debating. Fireplace asking whether Kari is a moral relativist. Kari says no. Bambalai asks whether elephants have morality and says they actually do. But then David Ball says, comrades, ask ourselves, are the variances within us greater than the variances between us collectively and the enemy? And then Bambalai and Fireplace agree that elephants have morality. Basically, yeah, I do think that the moral question is a big one. And it clearly stirs up strong reactions in a lot of people. And I think in some ways that goes to show how little of a shared moral center there is in some ways. The fact that there's such debate about it, or even the question of whether it's useful for revolutionary struggle. Because I think for me, like in my personal experience, without like, for free school, like literally what we say is like the moral struggle is the revolutionary. Like the moral imperative is the revolutionary. And I feel like for me, it's not like I necessarily set out saying like, I want to be a radical revolutionary and that's what I want to do with my life from day one. I feel like many people start from, I want to do the right thing. And if I do the right thing, like ultimately, what do I have to do? And even in the town hall, like our question is, the problems that we face, can they be fixed short of a revolutionary solution? And when we ask that question, we ask it as a moral question, actually. Like if we as human beings feel a moral compulsion to fix the world that we live in or the society that we live in, like how are those problems actually going to be solved? So
it's one of the, I think this question will be taken up, and coincidentally enough, in the next issue of Avant-Garde. Neha is writing an article about the Iran war, and this question of, does at this point, can white civilization even be called a civilization? Does it qualify as civilization if the criteria for civilization is like an actual moral center? And if white civilization doesn't have that at this point, then what should we even call it? But yeah, I think, yeah, I agree.
I just think that if consciousness is dynamic, it moves forward. What is the absolute truth that consciousness moves toward? And doesn't that truth have to be defined morally? Like, can you have consciousness moving towards an absolute truth without it moving towards a moral? Because I think even this thing of like, is advanced consciousness just like increased intelligence, like just logic? What is the point of increased intelligence if not like higher ends, like more advanced moral vision?
Because I feel like even the basic proposition of peace, it's like that's a very simple question, but it would take an advanced consciousness among the people to even be on the same page. Like peace is the primary obligation and responsibility of, let's say, the American people. Like it's something that's both complex and advanced, and at the same time very basic. Right.
Okay, well, that was a great conversation, and maybe we can continue it even next week to a certain degree. But okay, thanks for all the commenters. We enjoy your back and forth, and we look forward to seeing you next week.
Bye.
Bye.